Good evening and welcome. For the next little while, consider this a quiet companion in the background, something gentle to keep you company as the room grows still. Tonight, we will wander slowly through ancient Rome, not in a rush, but as if we are turning pages in a dim museum after closing time. We will look at emperors and senators, streets and homes, temples and baths, roads and markets, and the long habits of a city that became an empire. If you enjoy these calm journeys through history, you are always welcome to like the video, subscribe, or leave a soft comment about where you are listening from tonight, or what ancient world you might like to drift through next. There is never any hurry, only an open door for anyone who finds comfort in these quiet hours. Settle in wherever you are. Let the light soften a little. Let the day loosen its hold. Ancient Rome will unfold slowly, through small details and broad horizons, and we will begin at the edge of that world, where stone, smoke, and memory still seem to linger in the air. Ancient Rome began in the telling with a story that sits somewhere between legend and history. Long before marble temples and imperial processions, Rome was said to have been founded by twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, children of a royal bloodline and a river's mercy. The famous image is simple enough to picture in the quiet. A basket on the Tiber, reeds along the bank, a she-wolf bending over two abandoned infants. It is a story shaped by memory more than certainty, and historians have long understood that the early centuries of Rome are partly hidden behind later invention. Even so, myths like this mattered deeply to the Romans themselves. They gave the city a sense of destiny, as if Rome had been chosen from the beginning, rising from hardship, violence, and survival. The traditional date of Rome's founding, 753 BCE, was carefully preserved by Roman scholars, even though the actual process of settlement was likely gradual, with small communities growing on the hills above the river. In that early landscape, the city was not yet the immense power we now imagine. It was a cluster of homes, livestock, marshy ground, and rough roads, gradually forming an identity around the Tiber bend. The myth of origin, with all its drama, became a way of explaining a city that seemed, to its later inhabitants, almost too great to have begun so humbly. As Rome grew, its geography shaped its fate in quiet but important ways. The city sat on the Italian peninsula, not far from the center of the Mediterranean world, where trade routes, armies, and ideas could all move in different directions. The Tiber River gave Rome water, transport, and a natural boundary, while the surrounding hills offered defensive advantages in a time when protection mattered as much as comfort. Early Rome was built on 7 hills, at least in the traditional account, and those elevations helped create distinct neighborhoods and sacred places as the city expanded. The low ground between them, sometimes damp and difficult, was eventually turned into public space and monumental center. That slow transformation from marshy valley to civic heart is one of the small wonders of Roman history. The city did not appear already complete. It was shaped, layer by layer, by labor, drainage, trade, and political ambition. Even the climate played a role, gentle enough to support agriculture, warm enough for long seasons of movement and exchange, but not so predictable as to remove the need for adaptation. Rome's position allowed it to absorb influences from neighboring peoples, Etruscans, Latins, Greeks, and others, while still building a distinct identity of its own. In this way, geography was never merely background. It was one of the earliest architects of Roman power. Before Rome became an empire, it was a monarchy, though the line between early history and later legend remains blurred. Roman tradition remembers 7 kings, each associated with certain customs or institutions, though scholars treat these figures cautiously. Some may reflect actual leaders, while others may be symbolic, their stories gathered and reshaped over time. What is striking is not simply whether each king truly ruled, but how Romans later imagined the monarchy as a period of formation. The kings were linked with the first walls, the first laws, the first sacred rites, the first public works. In these tales, one ruler organizes the people, another expands the city's territory, another establishes religious practices, and another strengthens the forum-like spaces where civic life could gather. The last king, Tarquin the Proud, became a symbol of tyranny, the final contrast needed for Rome's preferred self-image as a republic born from the rejection of kings. Whether the details are exact is less important than the pattern they reveal. Rome's identity was built around the idea that power should be checked, that no single man should dominate forever, and that the city's earliest rulers prepared, perhaps unwittingly, the conditions for a different political order. The monarchy, as remembered by the Romans, belonged to a time before their deepest civic ideals had fully taken shape. It was a beginning, but also a cautionary tale. From that older world came one of Rome's defining political inventions, the Republic. In 509 BCE, according to Roman tradition, the kings were expelled, and power began to be shared among elected magistrates, most famously the consuls. This change is remembered almost like a civic awakening, though of course it emerged from conflict among elites, families, and competing interests. The Republic was not a democracy in the modern sense, but it did create structures intended to prevent a return to kingship. Annual offices, divided authority, and the Senate's influence all helped distribute power in ways that could be argued over, negotiated, and sometimes resisted. Roman political life became a careful balance of prestige, duty, and ambition. Magistrates marched with attendants, wore distinctive signs of office, and spoke in spaces that carried enormous symbolic weight. Behind these visible forms was a deeper Roman belief that public service should be tied to discipline and ancestry, yet also tested by election and accountability. The Republic's institutions were impressive not because they were perfectly fair, but because they were durable, adaptable, and deeply embedded in Roman habit. Over time, however, the same system that restrained kings also encouraged competition among the powerful, and that competition would eventually strain the Republic almost beyond repair. Still, in its early and middle centuries, the Roman Republic created the legal and political framework within which Rome expanded from a city into a commanding Mediterranean state. Roman society itself was carefully layered, and this layering can be felt in the surviving vocabulary of status. At the top stood the patricians, families who claimed ancient descent and privileged access to certain religious and political offices. Below them were the plebeians, a broad category that included everyone from poor laborers to wealthy landowners who lacked patrician ancestry. The distinction was not simply economic, it was social, legal, and symbolic. Over time, plebeians fought for greater rights through a long process of negotiation and pressure, known as the conflict of the orders. Out of those struggles came important gains: the tribunes of the plebs, assemblies that could challenge elite power, and legal reforms that made Roman law more public and predictable. One of the most famous early milestones was the 12 Tables, a set of laws displayed in public so that citizens could know the rules governing them. Even this achievement carries a faint sense of stone and dust, of words fixed in bronze or wood under the open sky. Roman society still remained unequal, of course, and slavery shaped daily life at every level, but the political tension between patricians and plebeians reveals something essential about Rome. It was a society that organized itself through hierarchy, yet also understood that order required compromise. Many Roman institutions were born not from harmony, but from persistent pressure and the need to avoid collapse. A Roman citizen's life was measured in duties as much as in rights. Citizenship in Rome was powerful because it connected a person to law, military service, public participation, and a shared civic identity. To be Roman was not simply to live within the city walls. It meant belonging to a community that could call upon you, protect you, punish you, and honor you. Citizens could vote in assemblies, though the practical weight of each vote varied depending on the structure of the assembly and social standing. They could appeal certain legal decisions, own property under Roman law, and pass on their status to their children. Yet citizenship was not equally experienced by all. Wealth, gender, age, and family rank all shaped what a person could actually do. Roman men of the upper classes moved through the public sphere in ways that were highly visible, while women, though central to household, family, and social continuity, were usually excluded from formal political office. Slaves, freed people, and non-citizens formed other large parts of the population, each with different degrees of liberty and constraint. What makes Roman citizenship so fascinating is that it could expand over time. Rome gradually extended rights to allies, colonies, and later conquered peoples, turning citizenship into one of its most effective tools of integration. This slow widening of belonging helped bind the Mediterranean world to Rome, not always peacefully, but often powerfully. In that sense, citizenship was both an honor and a technology of empire. Military service lay at the heart of Roman expansion, and the Roman army became one of the most disciplined and adaptable forces of the ancient world. Early on, Roman soldiers were not professional warriors in the later sense. They were citizens called to arms, usually landowners who could afford to equip themselves. Over time, the army developed into a more organized machine, with standardized equipment, training, ranks, and the famed legion as its core unit. The legion inspires such vivid imagery because it combined order and endurance, rows of shields, the gleam of metal fittings, the steady rhythm of marching feet on dust and stone. Roman military success did not depend solely on courage. It rested on engineering, logistics, discipline, and the ability to learn from enemies. Rome borrowed, adapted, and improved. It took what worked and made it Roman. Roads, forts, camps, and supply lines turned campaigns into sustained systems rather than brief outbreaks of violence. Soldiers built temporary camps each night in many periods, a habit that reflected the Roman fondness for structure even in uncertainty. As Rome fought nearby peoples and then distant powers, its army became both defender and engine of conquest. The military widened the Republic's influence, but it also brought wealth, land, and loyalty back to commanders who could sometimes outshine the state itself. In this way, the army was one of Rome's greatest strengths and one of the seeds of later political crisis. Roman religion was woven into public life so completely that it can sometimes seem less like a separate belief system and more like a shared rhythm of the city. The Romans were careful observers of ritual, signs, and tradition. They honored many gods and goddesses, each associated with specific powers, places, or responsibilities. Jupiter stood near the summit of divine authority, while Juno, Minerva, Mars, Venus, and others filled the sacred imagination of Roman life. But the Roman approach to religion was especially practical. Correct ritual mattered. Offerings had to be made in the proper way, with the proper words and timing, because divine favor was thought to depend on precision as much as devotion. Priests and priestly colleges oversaw sacred duties, and magistrates often participated in religious ceremonies as part of their public office. The Romans also paid attention to omens, whether in the behavior of birds, unusual weather, or unexpected events. This could feel in a modern light like an anxious world, but for the Romans it provided a framework of meaning, a way to interpret uncertainty. Temples were not simply architectural ornaments. They were homes for divine presence and civic memory, often placed in prominent public spaces. Even as Rome absorbed foreign gods and practices, it tended to organize them within its own system, making religion another field in which Roman order could be seen. In the evening quiet, it is easy to imagine the sound of temple bells, priestly chants, and the slow movement of processions through streets scented with incense. At the center of Roman domestic life stood the household, or domus, which was both a physical place and a social world. Wealthy Romans lived in houses built around interior courtyards, with rooms opening onto spaces where light and air could enter. These homes were often decorated with mosaics, wall paintings, statues, and fine household objects that signaled taste and status. One of the most beautiful aspects of Roman domestic culture is how much attention was given to the arrangement of space. The entrance, the atrium, the garden, the dining room, the private chambers, all of these areas helped structure the movement of family members, clients, servants, and guests. A Roman home was not private in the modern sense. It was often a place of daily business, ritual, and social display. Ancestor images might be kept there, reminding the living of family continuity and public reputation. In poorer housing, especially in crowded apartment blocks known as insulae, conditions could be far more cramped and precarious. Many Romans lived above shops or in narrow rooms with little access to light or clean water. The contrast between elite and ordinary housing reveals much about Roman urban life. It was a city of grandeur and congestion, of elegant courtyards and climbing staircases, of marble facades and practical repairs. Still, across the social range, the home remained a center of identity, where meals were shared, children raised, and the routines of life unfolded under the protection of household gods. Even in these early centuries, Rome was becoming a city of roads, markets, and movement. The Romans were remarkable builders, and one of their most lasting achievements was the development of infrastructure that linked regions together with unprecedented efficiency. Roads were not merely pathways, they were statements of control, channels of administration, and visible reminders that Roman power could reach far beyond the city itself. Alongside roads came bridges, aqueducts, sewers, ports, and public buildings. The famous road network, much of it developed later than the earliest republic, grew from a practical need to move troops and goods, but it also transformed daily life by connecting farms, towns, and provincial settlements. Markets in Rome would have carried a wide range of smells and sounds: olive oil, grain, fish, leather, fresh bread, heated conversation, the cries of sellers, the clatter of carts. Trade brought in luxury items from across the Mediterranean, yet even ordinary goods traveled through systems made possible by Roman organization. Water, too, became a matter of civic pride. Aqueducts channeled it over long distances, and public baths later turned cleanliness and sociability into one of the Roman urban experiences. What stands out is how Rome turned utility into spectacle. Even when serving basic needs, Roman public works often projected permanence, order, and greatness. In that sense, the city's stones were not silent. They spoke of administration, labor, and ambition, built slowly into the fabric of everyday life. Rome's road network became one of the quiet foundations of its power, and by the middle centuries of the Republic and Empire, the famous phrase that all roads lead to Rome carried more than poetic weight. The city sat at the center of a web of stone-paved routes that stretched across Italy and eventually far beyond it, carrying soldiers, tax collectors, merchants, travelers, and messages in a kind of ordered flow that could feel almost timeless. Many of these roads were carefully engineered with layers of packed earth, gravel, and stone, and some still survive in fragments, their surfaces worn by countless wheels and footsteps. In a practical sense, the roads moved grain, oil, timber, and marble. In a symbolic sense, they stitched the empire together, and yet even this great system was never completely smooth or effortless. Roads required constant repair, bridges collapsed in floods, and marshes or mountains could still make travel slow and uncertain. For all the discipline of Roman planning, the experience of moving through the empire remained shaped by weather, season, and terrain. A traveler might leave the noise of the city and spend days under open sky, stopping at way stations, listening to mule bells, and watching the landscape gradually change. The roads did not make distance vanish. They simply made it manageable, and in that management lay much of Rome's quiet genius. As the empire expanded, communication became one of the great achievements that held it together, though it was always limited by the realities of the ancient world. Official messages could move surprisingly quickly by relay, especially when couriers used the imperial postal system, but even then speed depended on good weather, available horses, and the condition of the route. News from a distant frontier might take days or even weeks to reach the capital, and the uncertainty of that delay shaped the rhythm of Roman politics. A victory, a revolt, a death, or a harvest failure could remain unknown in Rome long after it had already changed life elsewhere. Letters were precious carriers of presents. A handwritten message from a relative in the provinces might be folded and sealed with care, then entrusted to a traveller, a merchant, or a state courier. The idea of being informed was important, but so was the idea of being connected. Romans of the elite classes especially lived within a world of correspondence, where friendships, patronage, and political alliances could all be sustained across distance through carefully chosen words. And because messages travelled slowly, people often relied on rumour, oral report, and repeated hearsay, which gave Roman public life a texture of anticipation and uncertainty. Silence itself could be meaningful. A delay was not merely a delay. It could be a source of hope, anxiety, or dread. In a city as crowded as Rome, ordinary life depended on water, and the aqueducts became one of the most admired signs of Roman engineering skill. These long channels, some carried above ground on immense arches and others hidden beneath the earth, brought fresh water from distant springs and mountains into the city's baths, fountains, workshops, and homes. They turned water into an urban public good on a scale that had rarely been seen before. To stand near one of the great aqueducts was to feel a strange combination of delicacy and force. The stone supports looked monumental, yet the system worked through gravity and careful measurement, with a gentle, almost invisible slope guiding the water onward. Romans took pride in this mastery, and writers often contrasted the purity of the mountain sources with the teeming density of the city below. Still, the aqueducts were not magic. They demanded regular maintenance, and their channels could crack, clog with mineral deposits, or be tapped illegally by private users. As the water arrived in the city, it fed public fountains where people gathered with jars and buckets, and these spaces became part of daily social life. Water was not only utility, it was rhythm, refreshment, and civic order. In the heat of a Roman afternoon, the sound of running water must have offered a small and welcome relief. Among the most recognizably Roman public spaces were the baths, which were not simply places to wash but places to linger, converse, exercise, and unwind. The great bath complexes of the imperial period could be vast, with warm rooms, hot rooms, cold plunges, exercise courts, libraries, gardens, and corridors alive with echoing footsteps. People came for cleanliness, certainly, but also for sociability. The baths formed a kind of daily theatre of Roman life, where slaves, freed people, merchants, soldiers, and occasionally the wealthy moved through a shared environment under the eye of custom and class. The air in the heated rooms would have carried steam, oil, and the faint smell of perspiration, while attendants moved baskets of clothing, scraped skin with bronze strigils, and kept the furnaces stoked below the floors. Bathing was a civilizing act in Roman thought, but it was also practical in a world without modern plumbing. Even so, the baths were not uniform or perfectly healthy. Crowds, noise, and temperature shifts made them stimulating rather than peaceful in any modern sense. Yet for all that bustle, they also had a calming order to them, a familiar sequence of rooms and rituals that could make the body feel temporarily at ease. To move from hot to warm to cold water was to follow a small architecture of sensation, one that Romans returned to again and again. Religion in ancient Rome was deeply woven into public life, but it did not always look like a distant or private faith in the modern sense. Instead, it was often practical, ceremonial, and closely linked to the city's well-being. Romans believed that the gods should be honored correctly, with precision and respect, because good relations with divine powers helped safeguard the state. Temples stood in prominent places, sacrifices marked important occasions, and priests and priestesses performed rituals that were as much civic duty as spiritual expression. omens mattered. The flight of birds, the behavior of sacrificial animals, or an unexpected sign in the sky might be interpreted as a message, though specialists often disagreed on exactly what such signs meant. This reliance on ritual reflected a culture that valued order, memory, and proper form. At the same time, Roman religion was flexible, absorbing gods and practices from the peoples Rome encountered. Local deities could be linked with Roman ones, and foreign cults could find a place in the city so long as they did not appear to threaten public stability. That mixture of caution and openness made Roman religion both conservative and adaptable. It was not a single quiet doctrine so much as a layered civic habit, repeated day after day, with the hope that the gods would remain favorable and the world would stay in balance. The story of Roman women is often told through fragments, legal records, inscriptions, funerary monuments, and literary texts written mostly by men, which means their lives must be reconstructed carefully and with a sense of humility. Elite women could wield influence through family networks, marriage alliances, and household authority, even if they lacked formal political office. Many managed estates, oversaw slaves, raised children, and maintained the social bonds that gave Roman society much of its continuity. In inscriptions, women are sometimes praised for loyalty, modesty, and devotion to family, qualities valued in Roman moral language. Yet those ideal descriptions only partly reveal the full range of their experience. Women in markets, workshops, temples, and streets also participated in economic and religious life in ways that were more ordinary and less visible in surviving texts. Some worked as midwives, seamstresses, vendors, musicians, or attendants. Others were freedwomen who built new lives after manumission, still tied to former households but no longer enslaved. The legal system gave women different protections and restrictions over time, and those rules could be shaped by family status, property, and age. Because the evidence is uneven, historians must read between the lines. What emerges is not a single Roman female experience, but a wide landscape of roles, responsibilities, and constraints, all lived within the same noisy, sunlit, stone-built world. Children in Rome grew up in a society that expected them to learn discipline early, though childhood itself was not absent of warmth or play. Toys, dolls, marbles, balls, miniature furniture, and carved figurines have all survived from the ancient world, suggesting that children's imaginations found familiar outlets even under the stern gaze of Roman adulthood. Boys and girls were usually educated differently, especially within elite families, and lessons often began at home before moving to a formal teacher if the family could afford it. Reading, writing, recitation, and arithmetic were valued, but so were memory, obedience, and rhetorical skill. A child might spend long hours with wax tablets and styluses, copying letters by lamplight or listening to a tutor repeat lines of poetry. Yet education was not universal, and many children learned through labor rather than formal instruction, helping in workshops on farms or within households. The loss of a child was also heartbreakingly common in the ancient world, and this shaped Roman attitudes toward family and naming, as well as the tender imagery found on some tombstones. A small grave inscription might speak with surprising intimacy, preserving affection in stone. Childhood in Rome was therefore both ordinary and fragile, full of games and learning, but always shadowed by the realities of disease, danger, and short life expectancy. Roman food, like Roman society itself, ranged from simplicity to abundance, and the daily meals of most people were far less extravagant than the feasts later associated with imperial excess. The basic rhythm of eating often centered on bread, porridge, olives, cheese, vegetables, fruit, and wine diluted with water. For the poor, grain distributed by the state could be a vital staple, while for the affluent, meals might include fish, meat, sauces, eggs, honeyed desserts, and imported delicacies from across the Mediterranean. Markets in the city were crowded with voices, smells, and color, fish glistening in morning light, jars of oil stacked in rows, sacks of grain, bunches of herbs, and the sharp scent of fermented fish sauce used to season many dishes. Roman tastes were shaped by geography and trade. Citrus fruits, pepper, and spices traveled from far away, though often at great expense. Cooking vessels, hearths, and communal ovens all played a role in transforming ingredients into daily nourishment. Feasting had its own social meaning, especially among elites where displays of hospitality could reinforce status and patronage. Yet even the simplest meal carried cultural significance. Bread, wine, and salt were not merely foods, they were markers of shared life. To eat in Rome was to participate in a world of labor, exchange, seasonality, and hierarchy, all condensed into the quiet act of gathering around a table. The Roman army was one of the most disciplined forces of the ancient world, but its power rested not only on battle itself, rather on organization, engineering, and endurance. Soldiers marched with heavy loads, built camps each night, dug ditches, raised palisades, and maintained a rhythm that could feel almost mechanical in its precision. This was one reason Roman military power lasted so long. An army that could fortify its position quickly and move with repeated reliability had enormous advantage. Legionaries were trained to work as a unit, and that sense of order extended into the layout of camps, the chain of command, and the systems of supply. Still, life in the army was physically demanding and often uncomfortable. Soldiers endured rain, dust, cold, wounds, boredom, and long separations from home. They wrote letters when they could, carved names into wood or stone, and sometimes left behind records that reveal surprisingly human concerns about pay, clothing, food, or a missing blanket. The army was also a path to social mobility for some men, especially non-citizens who could earn citizenship after service in certain periods. But whether in distant Britain, along the Rhine in North Africa, or near the Euphrates, Roman soldiers lived within a strict world of drill and duty. Their presence carried both threat and reassurance depending on who was watching. Rome's empire was never made up only of Romans in the narrow sense. It was a vast and changing mosaic of languages, customs, local identities, and degrees of citizenship. People in Gaul, Spain, North Africa, Egypt, Greece, Syria, and many other regions did not simply become identical to the inhabitants of the city of Rome. Instead, they lived under Roman rule in varied ways, often preserving local traditions while also adopting Roman law, dress, names, architecture, or public customs. This blending is one reason the empire endured so long. It did not erase difference so much as incorporate it, though often on unequal terms. Some communities benefited from trade, roads, and relative peace. Others experienced conquest, taxation, and cultural pressure. Over time, many provincials rose into Roman civic life, serving in administration, the army, or urban elites. Inscriptions from the provinces reveal a dense and multilingual world where people identified themselves by family, city, occupation, and status. The empire's strength lay partly in this flexibility, but it also depended on hierarchy and force. The same system that allowed local adaptation could also demand loyalty and obedience. Rome's greatness, then, was not built from sameness. It was built from the management of difference, held together by law, prestige, and the long shadow of imperial power. And beneath all the official history, all the marble, roads, and triumphs, there was the quieter fact that Rome was a city of many deaths and many memories. Tombs lined roads outside the city walls, where the living and the dead shared the same travel routes in a symbolic way. Funerary inscriptions could be plain or elaborate, formal or intimate, but all of them point to a deep Roman concern with remembrance. To be named after death was important. To be mourned properly mattered. Some tombs show family members gathered in carved relief, others preserve only a few words about age, affection, status, or a life cut short. Funerals themselves could be public and emotionally charged, especially for the elite, with processions, eulogies, masks of ancestors, and a careful staging of family continuity. Yet most Romans were not honored in grand ceremony. Their memorials were simpler, and many have not survived at all. Still, the surviving stones offer a gentle counterpoint to the city's louder stories of conquest and rule. They remind us that Rome was also a place of grief, attachment, and the human wish not to disappear entirely. In that long and ordinary longing, the ancient world feels less distant, as though across the centuries one can still hear the soft persistence of names spoken once more into the evening air. Ancient Rome was a city of walls, gates, and thresholds, and one of the quiet marvels of its earliest landscape was the old defensive boundary that grew and changed with the city itself. In the beginning, Rome was not the endless stone sprawl we imagine today, but a modest settlement shaped by hills, marshes, and the slow practicality of survival. The earliest fortifications were likely made of earth, timber, and rough local stone, rebuilt again and again as the city expanded and as new fears emerged. Later generations would remember grand walls and mighty barriers, but the oldest Roman defenses were more fragile, more improvised, and perhaps more revealing. They suggest a people learning how to live together behind a line they drew in the landscape, creating a place that was not just inhabited, but guarded. There is something quietly human in that. A city begins as an idea of protection, and then grows into an empire without ever quite forgetting the need for fences, gates, and watchful edges. As Rome became more confident, its roads began to matter as much as its walls. Roman roads were not simply paths for travel, but instruments of state power, trade, and communication, laid out with a seriousness that still feels impressive today. They were built to endure, with layers of stone, gravel, and compacted earth creating surfaces that could carry marching soldiers, wagons, messengers, and merchants across great distances. Some roads were remarkably straight, as if the builders were determined to impose order on hills and marshes alike. The famous Via Appia, for instance, carried movement southward from the city with a long, deliberate line. Yet these roads were not all identical, and not every stretch was perfect. Some were repaired often, some fell into disrepair, and some vanished under later centuries. Still, the idea remained consistent. Rome linked itself together through roads that made the empire feel reachable, even at a distance. A traveler on one of these routes might hear the rhythmic sound of hooves and wheels on stone, see milestones standing at intervals, and feel the strange comfort of knowing that the same system of power that ruled the Mediterranean also measured the miles beneath their feet. That same Roman talent for order can be seen in something smaller and more intimate: their homes, especially the houses of wealthier citizens. The Roman house was often organized around an inner courtyard, a world turned inward from the noise of the street. At the entrance, visitors might pass through a narrow doorway into an atrium, a central room designed to collect light, rainwater, and attention. In many homes, a shallow pool in the floor gathered water from the opening in the roof, reflecting the sky above in a still, domestic rectangle. Around this space were rooms for sleeping, eating, receiving guests, and storing objects of family importance. Wealthier houses often included painted walls, mosaic floors, and gardens hidden within their walls, so that private life became a layered experience of enclosure and display. These houses were not only shelters but statements, quietly announcing status, ancestry, and taste. Yet they also reveal how Roman life often turned toward the interior, toward the managed and ritualized spaces where a family could present itself to the world while remaining partly concealed from it. The house was both a refuge and a performance, a place where daily life and public reputation shared the same threshold. And if houses created a private Roman world, baths created a public one. The Roman bath complex was among the most extraordinary institutions in the ancient city, a place where cleanliness, leisure, exercise, and social contact blended into a single, slowly unfolding routine. People of different ages and backgrounds came to bathe, talk, rest, and move through a series of warm, hot, and cool rooms. The atmosphere inside must have been rich with steam, footsteps, echoes, and conversation. There were places to oil the body, to scrape it clean, to exercise lightly, and to linger in conversation under vaulted ceilings. Large public baths became vast architectural statements, often decorated with marble, statuary, and intricate heating systems that carried warmth through floors and walls. For all their grandeur, they were also profoundly practical. In a city of many people, they made bodily care accessible and social life visible. We should not imagine a modern notion of privacy here. The baths were crowded, noisy, and deeply communal, though they likely had their own unwritten codes. Their popularity reminds us that Roman civilization did not separate the functional from the beautiful in the way later societies sometimes do. A bath could be an engine of public health, a social theatre, and a monument to urban pride all at once. Roman entertainment, too, had a scale that could be both exhilarating and unsettling. The amphitheatre, and especially the Colosseum, became an enduring symbol of Roman spectacle, where large crowds gathered to witness contests, executions, animal hunts, and staged displays of imperial power. The building itself was a masterpiece of practical design, with corridors, arches, seating tiers, and hidden systems that allowed tens of thousands of spectators to move in and out with surprising efficiency. From a distance, it rose like an enormous shell of stone and shadow. Inside, the experience was probably intense. Bright sun, dust, roar shouting, and the collective anticipation of a crowd trained to watch violence as public ritual. It is easy to focus only on the brutality, and that brutality was certainly real. Yet the amphitheatre also tells us something about Roman social order. It gathered people together in tiers that reflected rank and status. It projected the emperor's generosity and authority. It translated military conquest and animal capture into theatrical form. In that sense, the arena was not a distraction from Roman politics, but one of its most visible expressions. It was a place where society watched itself, where power became performance, and where the city's hunger for spectacle found a stone setting large enough to contain it. The same city that staged spectacle also believed deeply in omens, gods, and signs. Roman religion was not based on one simple creed, but on repeated acts, obligations, and careful attention to divine favor. Public rituals mattered enormously. Priests, magistrates, and officials performed ceremonies to keep peace with the gods, interpret unusual events, and maintain the correct relationship between human society and the sacred world. Birds were watched, entrails were inspected, and calendars were carefully marked with days suitable or unsuitable for business. Yet Roman religion was not always solemn in the modern sense. It was woven into life as a system of habits, responsibilities, and public display. Temples rose throughout the city, housing images of gods and places for offerings, while household shrines brought divine protection into daily domestic space. There was also a pragmatic side to Roman piety, a sense that proper ritual could help secure success in war, harvest, politics, and family life. At the same time, the Romans were open to new gods and foreign cults, absorbing, adapting, and sometimes fearing practices from other lands. Their religion was therefore both stable and fluid, deeply conservative in form, yet surprisingly flexible in content. It belonged to a world where the sacred was not separated from civic order, but threaded through it like a quiet current. Among the most revealing sources for Roman life are the words of Roman writers, and one of the most moving of these is the poetry of Virgil. His great work, the Aeneid, tells the story of Aeneas, a Trojan hero who journeys after the fall of Troy and becomes connected to Rome's mythical origins. It is not a simple tale of victory. It is full of loss, duty, sorrow, destiny, and the heavy burden of founding something larger than oneself. Virgil wrote in an age when Rome was trying to understand itself after civil wars and political upheaval, and his poem offers both grandeur and melancholy. It presents Rome as a civilization born from suffering and guided by fate, yet it never quite hides the cost of empire. Aeneas is often admirable because he endures, not because he is free. The poem's language in Latin was carefully shaped and highly musical, designed to be remembered and recited. Later Romans read it as both a national epic and a meditation on sacrifice. Even now, one can sense how deeply it tries to answer a timeless question: what does it mean to build a future when the past has already been broken? In that sense, the Aeneid is less a triumphant song than a long, twilight search for meaning. If Virgil gave Rome a heroic literary origin, Augustus gave it a political one. The reign of Augustus marked a profound transformation, though he carefully avoided appearing as a king. After years of civil war, he concentrated power in his own hands while preserving the outward forms of republican tradition. This delicate balance helped create the Roman Empire in practice, even if the old republic remained in name and ritual. Augustus promoted peace, public building, family values, and a vision of stability after chaos. Temples were restored, roads improved, laws revised, and monumental architecture reshaped the city. He understood that political authority could be strengthened by appearance as much as by force. Statues, coins, inscriptions, and public ceremonies all reinforced the image of a renewed Rome. Some historians see his rule as the beginning of long-term imperial stability. Others emphasize how much liberty was quietly reduced as power became more centralized. Both views contain truth. Augustus did not simply seize Rome. He reorganized its imagination. He made one-man rule seem like restoration, and in doing so he created a model of government that would shape the empire for generations. It is one of history's slow and astonishing turns. The Republic did not disappear overnight, but rather dissolved into a more carefully managed form of permanence. Not all Romans lived in palaces or monumental houses. Most inhabited apartment buildings, especially in crowded urban areas, where vertical living solved the practical problem of space. These apartment blocks, known as insulae, could rise several stories high and housed ordinary people, artisans, labourers, and families of modest means. They were often packed tightly together, and conditions varied widely. Some were sturdily built with shops on the ground floor, while others were vulnerable to fire, collapse, and poor maintenance. Water, heating, and sanitation were far less reliable than in elite homes, and life above the street level could be inconvenient or precarious. Yet the insula also reflects Rome's extraordinary urban density. The city was not an orderly museum of marble, but a living and often noisy metropolis, full of renters, hawkers, children, smells from kitchens and workshops, and the constant pressure of people trying to find space. There is a kind of social realism in the insula that softens the usual image of ancient grandeur. Rome was not only the seat of emperors and senators. It was also a place where many citizens lived in stacked rooms, climbed worn stairs, and looked out over crowded streets from upper windows catching the afternoon light. To understand the Roman world fully, one must also notice how much it depended on labor that was seldom celebrated. Slavery was deeply woven into Roman society, touching households, farms, workshops, mines, and government administration. Enslaved people came from many backgrounds: prisoners of war, the children of enslaved parents, debtors in earlier periods, and individuals captured or sold through the wider networks of the ancient world. Their lives varied enormously. Some worked in brutal conditions in mines or on large estates, while others served as tutors, secretaries, craftsmen, or domestic attendants. A few could be educated, manage accounts, or gain some degree of trust within a household. But none of these variations should obscure the core fact that slavery was a system of profound coercion and inequality, central to Roman wealth and daily functioning. The Romans accepted this institution as normal, which can be difficult to grasp from the modern perspective. Yet it shaped the texture of the entire society, influencing work, status, family structure, and even the rhythms of leisure. At the same time, manumission, the freeing of enslaved people, created a complex social category of freed persons who could become integrated in certain ways while still facing limits and prejudice. Roman society, for all its grandeur, was built on hierarchies that reached into the most intimate parts of life. Its monuments rested upon invisible toil, and its civility depended on systems of domination that it rarely questioned. Still, Romans were not only builders of power. They were also practical observers of the natural world, and their knowledge of medicine, engineering, and writing reveals a society deeply attentive to technique. Medical practice in Rome drew on Greek learning, local tradition, and the experience of military and urban life. Physicians treated wounds, fevers, digestive complaints, and chronic ailments with a mixture of theory and hands-on care. Some were highly educated and even attached to elite households. Others were itinerant or specialized in particular treatments. Ancient medicine could be effective in limited ways, especially in surgery, wound care, and diet, but it also included ideas that now seem strange or erroneous. The body was understood through balances, humors, and internal flows, and diagnosis often involved interpretation as much as observation. What is striking is not only the limits of their science, but the seriousness with which Romans tried to understand bodily suffering. They did not dismiss illness as purely mysterious. They measured, classified, prescribed, and experimented within the intellectual world they had. In that effort, one can see a familiar human desire to bring some order to pain, to name what is broken, and to believe that careful knowledge might restore harmony, if only a little. The city of Rome was not only a place of stone and law, but also a place where time itself could be gently arranged for public life. By the late Republic and into the Empire, Romans became increasingly attentive to the rhythm of the day, and in some settings they divided daylight into practical hours for work, ceremony, and rest. These hours were not all equal in length the way modern clock hours are, because they changed with the seasons, stretching in summer light and shrinking in winter darkness. That means a Roman afternoon in July could feel very different from one in December, with the same label covering a longer or shorter span of sun. It is a small detail, but it gives an intimate sense of Roman life because people were not living inside mechanical time. They were living inside the sky. The sun, the shadows on a colonnade, the movement of the forum, and the call of a water clock all helped shape the day. In the quieter homes of the wealthy, and perhaps in many ordinary routines as well, people would have understood the flow of time in a more natural, more embodied way. There is something soothing in that old arrangement when the world itself seemed to keep the hour. That same Roman world was filled with sound, and one of the most important sounds in the city came from water. In many places, Romans used clepsydry or water clocks to measure intervals when the sun could not be relied upon, such as at night or indoors. These devices worked by allowing water to drip at a controlled pace from one vessel to another, or out through a small opening, so that the passing level could mark the passage of time. They were used in courts, in workshops, in some military contexts, and in public life where speech had to be measured carefully. An orator in a trial might be allotted a certain amount of speaking time, and the judge or attendant could keep that time by watching the flow of water. The device was simple in principle, but elegant in practice, and it reminds us that Roman civilization was not only grand and marble-bright, it was also full of practical ingenuity. The quiet trickle of water in an otherwise tense room must have been a strangely calming counterpoint to the noise of argument. Even in a world of power and public display, the Romans trusted a small stream of water to keep order. Beyond the formal business of the city, Roman life also depended on a deep network of family, household, and memory. The Roman family was not simply the nuclear pattern familiar today, but a wider structure centered on the paterfamilias, the male head of household, whose legal authority was broad and in some periods nearly absolute. Yet daily life in the domus was not only about command. It was also about continuity, lineage, ritual, and mutual obligation. Women managed homes, oversaw children, and could wield considerable influence within the family sphere, even when the law placed them in a secondary position. Children learned by watching, by repeating, and by absorbing custom from the people around them. Slaves, freed persons, kin, and dependents all formed part of the household world, which could be crowded, layered, and emotionally complex. We should not imagine every Roman home as severe or silent. Archaeology and literature together suggest places of work, meals, domestic shrines, quiet conversation, and ordinary affection. The household gods, the Lares and Penates, often watched over these spaces, standing as reminders that family life was also sacred life. In the small corners of the house, near a lamp or a niche, one can almost feel the ancient tenderness of routine repeated day after day. Religious practice in Rome was also deeply woven into everyday life, and much of it was concerned less with belief in the modern sense than with correct action, balance, and reciprocity. Romans tended to think that the gods could be approached through observance, sacrifice, vows, and precise ritual language. Public religion was especially important because the welfare of the state seemed to depend on keeping proper relations with divine powers. Priests, magistrates, augurs, and other religious officials watched for signs in birds, thunder, entrails, and omens. Yet ordinary people also took part in this world through household observances, festivals, offerings at shrines, and private prayers. The Roman calendar was crowded with sacred days, some solemn and some joyful, and the cycle of the year itself became a sacred pattern. It is worth remembering that religious life in Rome was not always a matter of deep inner confession. Often it was a matter of doing the right thing at the right time, with the right formula in the right place. That discipline gave Roman religion its rhythm. A procession, the smell of incense, the murmur of a prayer, and the soft crackle of sacrificial fire would have created a sensory atmosphere both formal and strangely intimate, as though human life were gently nested inside a larger, unseen order. Among the most familiar spaces in the Roman world was the bath, and the bathhouse was far more than a place to wash. Public baths became one of the great social institutions of Rome, places where people gathered to exercise, converse, rest, and move through a sequence of hot, warm, and cold rooms. The air would have been thick with steam and the scent of oil, sweat, and heated stone. Bathing was not only about cleanliness, it was about sociability and civic habit, a kind of daily or near-daily pause in the pace of urban life. Wealthy patrons could sponsor elaborate bath complexes, and emperors in particular invested in these buildings as acts of public generosity and self-display. Yet many baths were open to a broad range of people, though not always together in the same spaces or under the same conditions. The social mixing could be lively, and Roman writers sometimes complained about noise, crowding, or bad behavior, which suggests that the baths were very much alive. Their architecture often included changing rooms, exercise courts, pools, and decorated halls, creating an environment of movement and repose. It is easy to imagine the slow echo of footsteps on stone, the splash of water, and the comfort of warmth against the skin after a long day in dust and sun. Roman roads are often described as the veins of the empire, and that image, while modern, captures something essential about their reach. These roads connected cities, military camps, ports, and administrative centers across an enormous territory. They were built with practical care, often layered in compacted earth, stone, gravel, and paving, depending on need and location. Milestones could mark distances, and bridges and drainage systems helped the roads endure weather and traffic. Some roads were designed for rapid military movement, while others carried merchants, couriers, travelers, and local traffic. What matters is that these routes did more than move armies. They also moved ideas, goods, letters, customs, and people, allowing Rome to remain connected to places far beyond the city itself. A road running through a quiet landscape might carry a cart of wine amphorae, a troop of soldiers, a local farmer, or a messenger with urgent news from a provincial governor. The road was therefore both a practical object and a symbol of Roman power. It made distance feel manageable. It made the empire legible. And in a slower sense, it helped turn scattered territories into a shared world. If roads bound the empire together on land, ships did the same at sea, and Rome depended heavily on maritime transport for grain, oil, wine, marble, and luxury goods. The city of Rome itself could not have been fed without vast shipments, especially from Egypt, North Africa, and Sicily. The grain fleets that reached the Tiber were vital to urban survival, and the state took their management seriously. The sea was both a highway and a danger. Navigation depended on weather, season, coastal knowledge, stars, and practical experience because ancient sailors lacked many modern tools. A voyage might be swift and efficient, or delayed by storms, piracy, or rough winds. The port at Ostia, and later Portus, served as the maritime mouth of Rome, full of warehouses, quays, cranes, labourers, and the heavy smell of tar, fish, brine, and grain. Cargo moved from ship to shore and then inland toward the city, passing through a complex logistical system that most inhabitants probably never saw in full. Yet they felt its consequences every day in the bread on their tables. There is a quiet wonder in that hidden chain of labour, from distant fields to harbour docks to urban ovens, all supporting the life of a vast metropolis. Roman society also relied on slavery to an extent that is hard to overstate. Enslaved people were present in households, farms, workshops, mines, armies, and public administration. Their labour supported Roman wealth at every level. Some worked under brutal conditions, especially in mines or on large estates, where life could be short and exhausting. Others served in more skilled roles as scribes, accountants, tutors, cooks, attendants, or managers. A few could accumulate savings, gain trust, and eventually be freed, becoming freedpersons with a place, though often a complicated one, in Roman society. But even the more favourable paths did not erase the underlying violence of enslavement. Roman law treated enslaved people as property, yet their lives were clearly more varied than a simple legal category can express. They formed families where possible, maintained relationships, resisted in small and large ways, and shaped the culture around them. Some inscriptions and literary references reveal affection, grief, and memory across the boundary of status. To think about slavery in Rome is to remember both the brilliance of Roman culture and the suffering beneath it. The city's splendor, the polished floors, the public monuments, the refined meals, and the confident language of power were all entangled with unfree labor. Among the most revealing Roman spaces were the tombs, because the dead remained present in public and private memory. Tombs lined roads outside many cities, especially along approaches where travelers would pass and see the names, portraits, and epitaphs of the departed. Roman funerary culture was rich with symbolism, from carved reliefs and inscriptions to offerings of food, flowers, and lamps. Families performed rituals to honor the dead, and certain festivals, such as the Parentalia, were dedicated to ancestral remembrance. The boundary between living and dead was not imagined as sealed and silent. Instead, the ancestors could remain part of the household's moral and emotional landscape. Tombs told stories. They marked status, profession, family affection, aspiration, and grief. Some were grand and carefully constructed. Others were humble, with brief inscriptions and simple stones. Together they form one of the most human archives from ancient Rome, because they preserve names that might otherwise have vanished. In them we find bakers, soldiers, freedwomen, children, spouses, and travelers whose lives were ordinary and therefore precious. The quiet endurance of a funerary inscription, worn by time and weather, can feel almost like a whisper carrying across centuries. Education in Rome, especially among the more privileged classes, was another thread in the fabric of society. Boys from wealthy families often learned reading, writing, arithmetic, and literature with the help of tutors or teachers, some of whom were Greek slaves or freedmen. Greek culture had enormous prestige in Rome, and educated Romans frequently admired Greek philosophy, rhetoric, and poetry, even as they insisted on Roman identity. Children might begin with basic literacy, then move on to memorization, recitation, and the study of authors such as Homer, Aeneas, Virgil, and others depending on period and taste. Rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking, became especially important for public life. A man aspiring to politics or law needed to speak with confidence, command language, and understand how to appeal to an audience. The schoolroom itself could be strict, with discipline, repetition, and the sound of voices reciting in unison. Yet education was also an act of cultural formation, shaping how Romans understood virtue, citizenship, memory, and authority. What a young person learned was not only facts or grammar, it was a way of inhabiting the world. In that sense, Roman education was a slow training in citizenship, one sentence and one example at a time. And finally, Rome was a city of constant transformation, though it often presented itself as ancient and enduring. Wooden structures gave way to stone, republic to empire, local custom to imperial administration, and provincial cities to Romanized centers with forums, baths, temples, and theaters. Yet change was not always dramatic or sudden. More often it came as layering, as the old remained inside the new. A temple might be rebuilt on an older foundation. A road might follow a route first traced by earlier peoples. A family might preserve ancestral names even as laws shifted around them. Rome's power lay partly in its ability to absorb, adapt, and reframe what it encountered. That is one reason the city's history feels so vast and so difficult to hold in a single glance. It was never one Rome alone, but many Romes overlapping in time. The shepherd settlement, the republican city-state, the imperial capital, the Christian center, the ruin, the memory, each left traces, each was once the present, and perhaps that is one of the quietest truths of ancient Rome, that even an empire built on conquest was also built on continuity, repetition, and the patient work of generations. By the middle of the Roman day, the smell of the city could change with the wind. In the crowded streets, people lived close to smoke, dust, animals, food stalls, and the odors of thousands of bodies. Yet ancient writers did not always describe this as a sign of misery. To them, the city's many smells were part of its living rhythm. One of the most important sources of perfume, medicine, and ritual scent was incense, brought from distant regions through complex trade networks. Frankincense and myrrh moved across deserts and seas before reaching Roman altars, bathhouses, homes, and tombs. These fragrant resins were expensive enough to suggest status, but common enough to become part of everyday religious life. They rose in thin curls of smoke before the gods, and their scent was meant to signal purity, prayer, and order. Romans also used oils scented with herbs, flowers, and spices, especially in baths and at banquets, where pleasant smells softened the discomforts of heat and crowding. Yet the ancient world was never neatly divided between pleasant and unpleasant odors. A bakery's warm bread, a stable's dung, a fish market's salt, and a funeral pyre's smoke all belonged to the same sensory landscape. Modern readers sometimes imagine Rome as either glamorous or filthy, but the reality was more layered and more ordinary. It was a civilization that understood smell as practical, symbolic, and emotional all at once, and for many Romans, a familiar fragrance could summon memory just as surely as a song. As the city grew, one of its most striking features was the contrast between public grandeur and private confinement. Wealthy Romans could live in houses centered around airy courtyards, with painted walls, fountains, and glimpses of sky, while many others occupied cramped apartments stacked above shops and workshops. These apartment buildings, called insulae, could rise several stories high and packed hundreds of people into a single block. The ground floor might hold taverns, storage rooms, or businesses, while higher levels became cheaper and more precarious. Fire was a constant danger, because cooking, lamps, and heating all relied on open flame. Structural collapse was another fear, especially in older or hastily built neighborhoods. Ancient sources sometimes mention landlords who cut corners or builders who used weak materials to raise profits. Still, these buildings were not simply symbols of misery. They were also places of noise, gossip, and social proximity, where Romans of different backgrounds lived within hearing distance of one another. Children played in narrow alleys, water carriers climbed stairs, shopkeepers worked beneath apartments. Life in an insula was vertical, crowded, and often noisy, but it also made the city feel intensely alive. When night came, people might hear carts rattling below, voices from nearby windows, and the echo of footsteps in shared corridors. It was a way of living that made privacy rare and community nearly unavoidable. From those crowded streets, the Roman world stretched outward with remarkable patience. Rome depended on roads not only for armies and officials, but for food, letters, tax goods, and the slow movement of regional exchange. The famous Roman roads were not all straight, smooth highways as later imagination sometimes suggests. Many were practical engineering projects built to last, with layers of stone and gravel beneath the surface and drainage, designed to survive weather and traffic. They linked military camps, towns, ports, and river crossings, giving the empire a skeletal structure of movement. Travelers used them on foot, by wagon, on horseback, and sometimes in hired carriages. Milestones measured distance and reminded passers-by that they moved through Roman space. Along the roads, inns of uncertain reputation, taverns and way stations offered rest, food, and information. Travel was slow by modern standards, but it was steady, and steadiness itself mattered. Messages could cross long distances in stages, carried by relay systems or trusted couriers. Grain, wine, olive oil, ceramics, and metal goods all depended on these routes. The road network was never just an abstract symbol of empire. It was a daily material reality of mud, stone, horses, wheels, and tired feet. In a world without engines, the road was one of Rome's quietest and most powerful inventions, allowing the distant edges of the empire to feel, however unevenly, connected to its center. That connection became especially visible in the foods people ate and in the great importance of grain. For most Romans, bread or porridge formed the base of the diet, especially among the poorer majority. Wheat and other grains moved into the city in huge quantities, often from Egypt, North Africa, and Sicily, where fertile lands could feed urban populations far beyond the regions where they were grown. The government took grain supply seriously because shortages could lead to unrest. Public distribution, though changing over time, became a crucial part of Roman political life. Feeding the city was not only a matter of charity, it was a matter of stability, loyalty, and control. At the same time, Roman diets varied enormously according to class, region, season, and access. Some people ate olives, legumes, cheese, vegetables, dried fruit, fish sauce, and occasional meat. Others enjoyed luxuries at banquets that ordinary families could never imagine. One of the famous Roman condiments was garum, a fermented fish sauce with a strong smell and a wide range of culinary uses. To modern noses it might seem sharp or strange, but Romans valued it deeply. Food in Rome was not only nourishment, it was social identity, trade, agricultural labor, and political administration compressed into daily meals. When a loaf was broken, it represented the work of farmers, millers, bakers, carriers, and officials, all tied together by the fragile business of feeding a city. In that same city, baths became one of the most beloved and democratic parts of Roman life. The great public baths were not just places to wash, they were social worlds. People came to bathe, exercise, talk, rest, read, and see one another. A bath complex might include changing rooms, cold pools, warm rooms, hot rooms, exercise yards, and courtyards adorned with statues or mosaics. The atmosphere was often steamy, loud, and full of movement. Oil was rubbed onto the skin and then scraped away with a curved tool called a strigil, taking dirt and sweat with it. Water was warmed through ingenious heating systems, and slaves or attendants managed many of the practical tasks behind the scenes. Although the wealthy could enjoy private baths in their homes, public baths were open to a broad range of people, making them one of the most recognizable expressions of Roman communal culture. Writers sometimes moralized about the baths, warning against vanity or idleness, but they remained enduringly popular because they answered a basic human desire for comfort, cleanliness, and contact. The bath was not silent, but its noise was different from the street's noise. It had the echo of dripping water, the murmur of conversation, the scrape of sandals, and the soft routine of daily care. For many Romans, bathing was as much about social balance as hygiene, a place where the body could be tended while the mind drifted into ordinary talk. The Roman calendar, too, was shaped by rhythms that guided public life and private expectation. Time was not experienced only as a line of dates. It was layered through festivals, market days, religious observances, and seasonal work. Many Roman months carried the memory of older agricultural cycles, even as the city itself became increasingly urban and imperial. Religious festivals honored deities, ancestors, and civic myths, while some public ceremonies marked the foundation of the city, military victories, or moments of communal crisis. The calendar was crowded enough to make Rome feel continually in motion. Priests, magistrates, and communities all played roles in keeping ritual time. Certain days were favorable for business or law, while others were restricted by custom or sacred obligations. Even the naming of years could emphasize public office rather than a continuous count, reminding Romans that time was tied to government and memory. This made the Roman relationship to time practical, but also ceremonial. A festival could interrupt work and gather families, neighbors, and crowds into shared experience. The city's sacred life was not hidden away. It appeared in processions, sacrifices, garlands, music, and animal offerings. To modern ears, the repetition might seem formal, but to Romans it helped stabilize a world of uncertainty. When one follows the calendar carefully, ancient Rome can seem less like a single historical moment and more like a living sequence of repeated beginnings. That sense of sequence also shaped the Roman army, one of the empire's most important institutions. The army was not only a tool of conquest, though conquest was certainly part of its history. It was also a training ground, an employer, a road builder, a frontier presence, and a major engine of Romanization in many regions. Soldiers marched long distances, constructed forts, dug ditches, repaired roads, and carried standardized equipment that made the legions recognizable across the empire. Discipline mattered enormously. Commands had to be obeyed quickly, because large bodies of men needed order in battle, camp, and movement. Yet soldiers were also people with fears, ambitions, superstitions, and habits. They wrote letters home, complained about supplies, made friends, and sometimes settled after service in the very regions they had helped defend. Over time, the army became deeply tied to politics, especially as generals gained personal loyalty from troops. In the late Republic and Imperial period, soldiers could shape the fate of emperors. But even at the everyday level, the army extended Roman power into landscapes that were not always wholly settled or pacified. Forts at frontiers were places of work, trade, boredom, discipline, and long waiting. The life of a soldier was often less like the glory of later art and more like endurance. Heavy gear, changing weather, watch duties, camp routine, and the constant possibility of conflict. Yet through all of this, the army helped make Roman rule visible in stone, road, and habit. Beyond the army, Roman engineering left its mark in a quieter and often more beautiful form: the aqueduct. Water was one of Rome's great necessities, and the city's ability to move it over long distances became a source of wonder even in antiquity. Aqueducts used gravity rather than force, guiding water along carefully measured routes through channels, tunnels, and where needed, arches rising above the landscape. They brought fresh water to fountains, baths, gardens, homes, and public reservoirs. the sight of an aqueduct with its repeating arches cutting across a valley could seem almost serene, a line of stone carrying life itself. But the system was also practical and demanding. It required constant maintenance, protection from leaks, and management of distribution. Water in the city served drinking, washing, industry, and public entertainment. The Romans were not the only ancient people to develop sophisticated hydraulic systems, but they turned water management into a hallmark of urban greatness. Their aqueducts revealed a deep understanding of surveying and materials, yet they also depended on labor and authority. Engineers, workers, officials, and enslaved laborers all helped maintain them. In the background of Rome's splendor lay this hidden infrastructure, a silent technology that made the baths possible, the fountains run, and the city feel less dry and less vulnerable. Even now, the remains of aqueducts can seem restful in their own way, as if stone had learned to carry a stream. Among the many public structures of Rome, none captured the imagination quite like the amphitheatre. The most famous of all, the Colosseum, became a symbol of Roman spectacle, though it was only one example of a broader culture of public entertainment. Gladiatorial games, animal hunts, staged spectacles, and mock dramas drew huge crowds. These events were not casual amusement in the modern sense. They were deeply connected to status, political generosity, religious commemoration, and the display of power. Wealthy sponsors or emperors could present games to win favor and demonstrate abundance. The audience itself was carefully ordered by rank, with seating that reflected social hierarchy. Yet the emotional experience of the games could be shared across classes: anticipation, applause, suspense, and collective reaction. Ancient sources and modern scholarship alike remind us that the violence of the arena cannot be softened into harmless entertainment. The spectacles were real and often brutal. Still, their function in Roman culture was larger than violence alone. They helped define public life as something communal, visible, and staged. The architecture of the amphitheatre magnified that effect with its curves, corridors, and capacity for controlled crowd movement. People entered through numbered gates, found their places, and watched the carefully managed drama unfold below. The event was both orderly and chaotic, regulated and unpredictable. In that balance, Rome displayed another side of itself, not just a city of law and roads, but a city of performance, power, and shared attention. Writing itself, meanwhile, was woven into Roman life in ways both grand and humble. We often remember Latin literature through poets, historians, and speeches, but most writing in Rome was practical. It appeared on tablets, wall inscriptions, tombstones, shipping labels, official notices, military records, wax tablets, and letters. Some of these texts were carefully crafted, others were rough, abbreviated, or hastily scratched. Inscriptions on stone preserved names and achievements, while everyday writing on plaster or wood captured elections, greetings, jokes, curses, and advertisements. Literacy was not universal, but writing still shaped the world around even those who did not read fluently. A painted electoral slogan on a wall could influence public memory. A merchant's label could organize goods. A tomb inscription could preserve a family's presence long after burial. Roman writing materials varied by purpose and expense, from papyrus and parchment to wax-covered tablets that could be reused. Books existed, but they were copied by hand and circulated unevenly, making reading a more deliberate act than it is today. In a culture that prized rhetoric and memory, writing did not replace speech. It supported it, preserved it, and extended it across distance and time. The surviving traces can feel intimate because they let us glimpse Roman voices in fragments: a request, a warning, a complaint, a memorial. Together they remind us that ancient Rome was not only made of emperors and monuments, but of lines scratched carefully into matter, hoping to outlast the day. In the Roman world, a person's status could be read in the fabric wrapped around the body, and few garments carried as much meaning as the toga. It was not an easy garment to wear. Heavy, wide, and awkwardly draped, It demanded practice, patience, and a certain amount of wealth, because ordinary labourers rarely wanted such a cumbersome thing. The toga was usually made of wool and could be strikingly large, sometimes nearly impossible to manage without assistance. Yet this inconvenience was part of its message. To wear a toga was to signal citizenship, leisure, and participation in a public life that did not involve manual work. In the bright Roman sun, the white cloth would have glowed against the stone of the forum, while dust and oil and sweat slowly marked the day's movement across the city. There were different kinds of togas for different moments in life and politics. A bright white toga might indicate adulthood or public standing, while a specially whitened toga could mark a man seeking office. Darker or more decorated versions appeared in mourning or triumph. In this way, cloth became language, and the body itself became a place where Roman identity was carefully displayed and carefully read. From clothing, the Roman eye could move easily to the home, where daily life often centered on a room that might seem quiet to us, but which held a great deal of social meaning. Roman houses, especially those of the wealthy, often contained an atrium, an open central space that admitted light through a hole in the roof. Rainwater fell into a basin below, and the room became a small indoor world shaped by sun, shadow, and the faint echo of footsteps. Walls might be painted in red, black, yellow, or deep blue, with scenes that suggested gardens, myths, or impossible architectural views stretching into imagined distance. Mosaics underfoot could shimmer with tiny stones arranged into geometric patterns, fish, masks, vines, or the names of household owners. The house was not only a private retreat, it was also a social stage. Clients, visitors, business partners, and petitioners would enter at set hours, encountering the family in a space that balanced intimacy with performance. Even the arrangement of rooms reflected hierarchy. Some areas were open and public, others reserved, narrow, or richly decorated for special meals. A Roman house could therefore feel both domestic and political, full of quiet routines and formal expectation. Nearby in the city, the baths offered another kind of Roman order, one that mixed cleanliness, conversation, and leisure in a way that feels almost soothing to imagine. Public baths were not merely places to wash. They were cultural institutions, often grand in scale, with changing rooms, exercise yards, warm chambers, hot rooms, and cool pools. The air inside could smell of steam, oil, sweat, and stone warmed by hidden fires running beneath the floors. Romans often anointed themselves with oil before scraping it away with a curved metal tool called a strigil, a cleansing routine that seemed practical but also deeply social. Men and women generally used baths at different times or in separate facilities, though local customs varied and rules could be flexible over time. The baths were one of the great equalizing spaces of Roman life, at least in appearance, where people from different backgrounds might share a bench, a conversation, or a complaint about the weather. At the same time, the baths displayed the power of the empire through engineering. Their complex heating systems, vast reservoirs, and monumental architecture revealed a civilization able to organize labor and resources on a grand scale. To step into a bathhouse was to enter a world of warmth, water, marble, and murmuring voices. Roman roads, too, carried the empire's influence far beyond the city, and their straightness became almost symbolic of Roman discipline itself. They were not perfectly straight in every case, but the Romans did favor efficient routes that cut across landscape with impressive confidence. Roads linked forts, towns, farms, mines, harbors, and administrative centers, allowing soldiers, merchants, messengers, and officials to move with remarkable speed for the ancient world. Beneath the visible surface was usually a carefully layered structure of stones, gravel, and compacted materials that helped the road endure weather and heavy traffic. Along many routes, milestone markers indicated distance and often named the emperor responsible for repairs or construction, turning the road into a rolling monument of authority. Travelers might hear cart wheels clattering, horses snorting, and the distant calls of way stations where food and rest could be found. In some places, the roads became channels for ideas as much as goods. Along them moved languages, religious practices, fashions, and stories. The network was enormous, and though not every road was equally maintained, the whole system gave the empire a practical skeleton. The famous phrase about all roads leading to Rome is an oversimplification, but it captures something true. The city stood at the center of a web of movement, and the roads helped make that center feel reachable. Just as roads connected regions, Roman trade connected the daily lives of ordinary people to distant places they might never see. Grain from Egypt and North Africa, wine from Italy and Gaul, olive oil from Hispania, spices from the Eastern Mediterranean, and luxury goods from farther still all passed through the empire's ports, roads, and warehouses. A market in Rome could offer fish sauce in clay jars, figs, dates, lentils, honey, cheese, and imported perfumes. Amphorae, the tall storage jars used for shipping liquids and foods, piled up in great numbers and sometimes formed entire artificial hills when broken and discarded. One such mound, later known as Monte Testaccio, still stands as a silent record of consumption on a massive scale. Trade made the city smell different in different districts. Salt fish near the docks, baking bread near the ovens, incense near temples, leather near workshops, and fresh fruit in the market lanes. Yet trade also carried risk. Storms, pirates, bad harvests, dishonest weights, and unstable politics could all disrupt supply. Rome's appetite required careful administration and constant movement. The city's wealth depended not only on conquest, but on the quieter, ongoing labor of transport, accounting, and exchange, much of it hidden behind the scenes. The Roman economy rested on labor that was often invisible in elite writing, especially the labor of enslaved people. Slavery in Rome was widespread and varied, and enslaved individuals could be found in households, farms, mines, workshops, docks, offices, and even positions requiring education or administrative skill. Some were prisoners of war, others born into slavery, and still others acquired through trade. Their experiences differed enormously, from brutal conditions in mines to relatively privileged service in wealthy homes, though all remained bound by coercion and legal vulnerability. Roman authors sometimes discussed slavery in practical or moral terms without questioning the institution itself, which makes the surviving evidence both rich and unsettling. An enslaved person might manage accounts, educate children, grind grain, clean rooms, tend a shop, or labor under the open sky in chains. Manumission or formal release from slavery was possible in some cases, and freed people could sometimes build new lives, though social stigma and legal limitations remained. The Roman world relied heavily on this system, yet it rarely paused to acknowledge the human cost in full. Behind the polished floors, the theatrical banquets, and the glittering public life, there were countless lives shaped by compulsion, endurance, and silence. Roman religion filled the city with rhythms of ceremony, offerings, and careful attention to signs. The gods were not distant in a modern sense. They were woven into civic life, household routines, military action, and public festivals. People might pray before meals, sacrifice at temples, consult priests, or observe rituals meant to keep the relationship between human beings and divine powers in balance. The Romans were famously attentive to omens, interpreting unusual bird flights, lightning, dreams, or other events as possible messages from the gods. This did not mean that every Roman was equally devout in the same way. Religious practice could be public and official, personal and intimate, serious and habitual all at once. Shrines stood at crossroads, in homes, along roads, and in public squares. Offerings of fruit, wine, incense, or animals might be made with precise formulae because correct action mattered as much as sincere feeling. Even the empire's expansion was often framed religiously, with victory and peace attributed to divine favor. For Romans, the sacred was not separate from daily life. It was present in the sound of ritual words, the smoke rising from altars, the hush before a sacrifice, and the conviction that proper conduct helped sustain the world itself. That sense of order extended to the Roman military, which was not only a fighting force but also a machine of organization and endurance. Legionaries marched long distances with equipment, tools, supplies, and weapons, building camps as they went. These camps were laid out with astonishing regularity, almost like temporary cities marked by streets, gates, and organized sectors. Discipline was strict. Soldiers trained to move as a unit, to throw javelins, to construct fortifications, and to withstand hardship. Their armor evolved over time, but the image of the Roman soldier often includes a helmet, shield, heavy sandals, and the sense of disciplined weight carried across the landscape. Military life could be exhausting, dangerous, and monotonous, with long periods of waiting broken by sudden violence. Yet service also offered salary, status, and after years of duty, the hope of reward or land. The army was a powerful agent of Romanization, spreading Latin, roads, camps, and administrative habits across conquered regions. Still, local realities always shaped imperial power, and Roman soldiers were not invincible. They could be outmaneuvered, ambushed, starved, or overwhelmed. The military's real strength lay not only in battle, but in its ability to project a durable presence, camp after camp, mile after mile. Roman time itself was measured with a blend of practicality and observation that feels both familiar and far away. The day was divided into hours, but those hours did not always match modern fixed-length time in the same way, because daylight varied through the seasons. A summer hour was longer than a winter hour. Sundials and water clocks helped track the passage of time, though both had limits and required attention. The Romans organized the calendar through a complex system of months, festivals, political cycles, and occasional reform. Before Julius Caesar's adjustment, the calendar had become tangled and irregular, with priests responsible for inserting extra time when needed, a process sometimes influenced by politics. The Julian reform created a more stable solar calendar, one of Rome's most lasting contributions to later history. Still, even with reforms, time remained deeply social. Days were marked by market cycles, court sessions, religious festivals, military schedules, and public games. For many people, the sense of time came less from abstract numbers than from the rising and falling of light, the heat of the afternoon, the shadow lengthening across a courtyard, or the bell-like rhythm of routine tasks. Roman time was not only measured, it was lived. And within that measured world, Roman entertainment offered moments of release that could be dazzling, noisy, and intensely public. The amphitheatre, most famously the Colosseum in Rome, gathered thousands of spectators to watch gladiatorial contests, animal hunts, executions, and elaborate spectacles staged with immense effort. The architecture itself was part of the drama. Arches, stairways, entrances, and hidden mechanisms allowed the movement of crowds, performers, and animals with startling efficiency. The atmosphere inside could be electric, filled with cheers, wagers, approval, and the collective intensity of a population gathered in one place. Yet the violence should not be romanticized. Gladiators were often enslaved, condemned, or specialized fighters whose lives were shaped by danger and display. Their combats were governed by rules, training, and varying levels of ritualized showmanship, but the reality remained harsh. Still, Romans saw such spectacles as part of civic life, tied to honor, power, generosity, and the emperor's role as provider of public entertainment. The amphitheatre was a place where the empire could watch itself watching, a vast bowl of stone containing fear, admiration, and disciplined spectacle beneath the open sky. For all its grandeur, Roman civilization was also full of small, practical details that made life work from day to day. People wrote on wax tablets, papyrus, and occasionally more durable materials. They sealed letters with clay or wax. They used bronze keys, needles, combs, spoons, lamps, and cooking vessels shaped by local need and taste. In kitchens, Smoke lingered from fires and charcoal, while bread baked in ovens and stews simmered in pots. Children learned songs, prayers, family duties, and sometimes letters, though education was uneven and often tied to wealth or social expectation. In the countryside, farmers watched weather, soil, and seasons with close attention, relying on work that was demanding and uncertain. In towns, shopkeepers stood in narrow front rooms opening onto the street, where business and daily conversation flowed together. Ancient Rome can sometimes appear to us as marble, conquest, and emperor portraits, but it was also made of these quieter textures: oil in a lamp, water in a basin, dust on sandals, a greeting at a doorway, and the soft closing of shutters at dusk. When we imagine Rome fully, we begin to see not just power, but a whole human world, ordinary and immense, still and restless, leaving traces in stone, clay, and memory. As the Roman world became more crowded and more carefully governed, one of the great concerns of daily life was something as ordinary as bread. Rome did not simply rely on local markets and small household ovens. It built an enormous system to bring grain into the city from the countryside, from Italy, and eventually from distant provinces across the sea. Egypt and North Africa became especially important, their harvests moving through harbours, warehouses, and canals before reaching the capital. A great deal of this grain was collected as tax, then redistributed through state channels, helping to keep the city fed and politically calm. In the humid heat of an imperial port, sacks of wheat would be loaded by labourers whose names are mostly lost to us, yet their work was essential to the daily rhythm of Rome. The movement of grain was so important that emperors paid close attention to it, because a shortage could quickly become unrest. In a city of 1 million people, or perhaps somewhat fewer depending on the period and the scholar, the humble grain supply was not merely an economic matter. It was part of public order, part of survival, and part of the quiet machinery that allowed the empire to imagine itself stable. This dependence on grain helps explain why Roman politics so often reached far beyond the city walls. Control over provinces was never only about glory or military victory. It was also about the flow of food, the security of sea lanes, and the reliability of harvests. A poor season in one region might be balanced by a better one elsewhere, but a disruption in transport could matter just as much as a failed crop. Ancient writers sometimes describe the panic that spread when supplies slowed, and although their accounts can be dramatic, they reflect a real vulnerability. Rome's bread system rested on ships, weather, bureaucracy, and the labor of thousands of people who rarely appear in marble or bronze. In the cool stone granaries, grain waited in dim rows, protected as well as possible from damp and vermin. From there it would make its way into mills, bakeries, and kitchens. Even the simple smell of baking bread, rising from a neighborhood oven in the early morning, would have been part of the sensory landscape of Roman life, familiar to rich and poor alike, and quietly connected to the power of an empire. That same empire depended not only on harvests, but on roads. Roman roads have become almost legendary, and with some reason. They were not all perfectly straight, nor all paved in the same way, but they were built for endurance, movement, and military speed. Mile markers stood beside them, bridges crossed rivers, and way stations offered rest for travelers and official messengers. The hard-packed layers beneath the surface, the careful drainage, and the compacted stones gave these roads a surprising durability, some surviving in fragments until today. Soldiers marched along them, merchants drove carts on them, and administrators used them to gather news from distant regions. In the steady rhythm of hooves and wheels, information could travel faster than in many other ancient societies. The road was not only a line on the ground, it was a kind of promise that the Roman state could connect one place to another, one authority to another, one command to its execution. And yet the roads were not always silent corridors of order. They could be dusty in summer, muddy after rain, and crowded with all the traffic of empire. One might pass a funeral procession, a team of mules, a courier under pressure, or a religious traveler carrying offerings to a shrine. In some places, milestones recorded the name of the emperor who had repaired or extended the route, turning infrastructure into a form of public memory. The emperor's presence could be felt through stone and inscription, even far from Rome itself. Scholars sometimes note that the romance of Roman roads can obscure how much labor they required. Quarrying, hauling, leveling, and paving took time and skilled supervision. In that sense, the roads were as much monuments to organization as they were to engineering. Their usefulness lay not only in what they were made of, but in the discipline needed to build and maintain them over long distances and long generations. If roads carried movement across land, the Roman calendar tried to organize time itself. At first, Roman timekeeping was complex and uneven, shaped by older traditions and later reforms. By the late Republic and early Empire, Julius Caesar's reform had created the Julian calendar, a much more regular system based on the solar year. This brought greater predictability to civic life, agriculture, legal scheduling, and religious festivals. Months acquired familiar lengths, though the names and rhythms of Roman time still carried traces of older customs. The calendar was not simply a technical tool. It reflected the state's desire to bring order into the cycle of seasons, taxation, and ritual obligation. In Rome, marking the day was a public act. Festivals, market days, court sessions, and sacred anniversaries all occupied their proper place, and time became something administered as carefully as roads or grain. That ordered sense of time was tied to the religious world as well. Roman religion was practical, ceremonial, and deeply embedded in public life. It was not centered on a single holy book or one exclusive path to belief, but on correct relationship with many gods, spirits, and sacred traditions. Ritual was often a matter of precision. Offerings had to be spoken clearly, gestures had to follow custom, and festivals had to occur at the proper moment. Priests did not necessarily function like later clergy, and many religious duties were performed by magistrates or household heads. The Roman family itself was a small sacred unit, with the household gods, or lares and penates, watched over through lamps, food, and prayer. In the shadowed domestic shrine, a family might honor ancestors and protective powers, while the wider city honored Jupiter, Juno, Mars, Vesta, and many others. It was a religion of daily habit as much as of grand temples. Roman religion also had a strong relationship with uncertainty. When people faced danger, illness, or war, they sought signs. The flight of birds, the condition of sacrificial animals, unusual weather, and dreams could all be interpreted as messages from the divine. Official specialists called augurs and haruspices were consulted to read these signs, though not every Roman trusted every interpreter equally. Ancient authors sometimes make fun of divination, yet they also show how deeply people relied on it. In a world where so much could not be controlled, ritual became a way of asking the gods for favor and making human action feel aligned with cosmic order. Even the emperor, despite all his power, had to present himself as respectful of divine custom. Temples and rituals helped tie political authority to sacred legitimacy, and so religion was never merely private in Rome. It was woven into the public fabric, like thread through a garment. Among the most visible forms of Roman religion was the temple, and one of the most enduring images from the ancient world is the Pantheon. The building we see today is mostly from the time of Hadrian, though an earlier structure stood on the site before it. Its great dome, with the open oculus at the top, creates a remarkable interior space where light shifts slowly through the day. Sunlight falls in a bright circle and moves across the walls and floor, as if measuring time in silence. The proportions are extraordinary, and the engineering remains one of Rome's greatest achievements. Yet the Pantheon was not only a triumph of architecture, it was also a statement about universal divine presence, a place associated with many gods, many powers, and the widening reach of imperial Rome. When one stands inside such a building or imagines standing there, it is easy to feel the combination of grandeur and stillness, stone and sky, power and reverence. The Roman world also produced a quieter kind of architecture in its homes. Wealthier houses, especially in cities like Pompeii and Herculaneum, often included atriums, peristyles, gardens, painted walls, and carefully arranged rooms for guests and family life. Public and private spaces were not sharply divided in the way they often are today. The entrance of a house might open into an area where clients were received each morning, because a Roman elite home was also a center of social obligation. Below the surface of this elegant arrangement lay the work of enslaved people, who cooked, cleaned, served, and maintained the household. Their labor made the polished life of the elite possible, though it is often only faintly visible in surviving texts. Frescoes on villa walls could depict mythological scenes, still lifes, landscapes, or delicate architectural fantasies. In candlelight or oil lamp glow, these rooms would have seemed rich with color, while the sounds of conversation, footfalls, and kitchen activity moved through them in layered rhythms. Pompeii, in particular, offers a strangely intimate glimpse into Roman domestic life, because it was buried by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in AD 79. Ash and pumice preserved buildings, objects, and even some traces of bodies, freezing a moment of catastrophe that scholars continue to study. Yet Pompeii should not be imagined as a perfect snapshot of all Roman life. It was one town with its own local character, economic patterns, and social tensions. Still, it shows something deeply human: painted walls with mythological scenes, counters from taverns, graffiti on plaster, jars in kitchens, and the remains of bread loaves in ovens. The eruption transformed ordinary things into archaeological evidence. It also reminds us how vulnerable ancient life was to forces beyond control. The ground could shake, the mountain could awaken, and a busy city could vanish under ash in a matter of hours. In that uneasy silence after disaster, the fragility of Roman confidence becomes clear. Another revealing aspect of Roman society was the place of entertainment, especially the theatre and amphitheatre. Romans loved spectacle, though the forms it took varied by place and period. Theatre brought myth, comedy, and political commentary to the public, while amphitheatres hosted gladiatorial combat, animal hunts, and staged executions. These events could be loud, crowded, and intense, but they were also highly organized. Seating reflected social rank, with senators, equestrians, and ordinary citizens placed in distinct zones. The architecture itself guided the crowd, containing movement while amplifying collective reaction. A performance could become a demonstration of order, hierarchy, and shared identity, even when the content involved violence. Ancient spectators may have felt a mixture of excitement, anxiety, and fascination. The smell of dust, sweat, food, and animals would have filled the arena, while trumpets, shouts, and applause rose into the open air. These spaces tell us much about Roman values, but also about the human attraction to drama, display, and the emotional charge of watching others perform or struggle in public. Yet not all Roman leisure was public, and not all cultural life was so harsh. Literature, philosophy, and education also flourished, especially among the literate classes. Boys from wealthier families often studied grammar, rhetoric, and literature, sometimes with Greek as well as Latin texts. Education in Rome was practical in one sense, because public speaking and legal argument mattered greatly, but it also connected the elite to a broader Mediterranean intellectual world. Roman authors borrowed heavily from Greek models while developing their own styles and themes. Virgil, Ovid, Horace, Cicero, Seneca, Tacitus, and many others shaped Roman memory through poetry, history, philosophy, and political thought. Their works have survived unevenly, and what remains may represent only a fraction of what was once read, recited, copied, and discussed. Still, through them we hear a society thinking about duty, fate, love, power, exile, and mortality. Their language can feel calm or severe, playful or grave, but it preserves the mental atmosphere of Roman elite culture with unusual intimacy. Writing itself was both common and fragile in Rome. Papyrus, wax tablets, parchment, and pottery sherds all served as writing surfaces. Official inscriptions were carved into stone or bronze, while letters and accounts circulated on more perishable materials. A merchant might keep records on wax tablets, a soldier might send a message from a frontier camp, and a parent might write to a child in another city. Some of these documents survive only by accident, preserved in dry deserts, waterlogged pits, or volcanic ash. They show how extensively Roman life depended on writing, not just for high literature, but for contracts, receipts, prayers, labels, and private communication. In a quiet way, the empire was held together by written traces. Even a short inscription on a tombstone could preserve a name, an age, a relationship, a memory. The Roman world spoke in stone and ink, and in the surviving fragments we can still sense the people who once expected their words to endure. Over all of this, of course, stood the emperor, a figure whose power was both immense and carefully staged. The Roman Empire was not ruled in the modern sense by a single absolute monarch with a fixed constitutional formula, but emperors accumulated authority through military command, political office, religious prestige, and dynastic control. Their image appeared on coins, statues, triumphal arches, and official documents. Some emperors governed wisely, some cruelly, many somewhere in between. Ancient historians often judge them harshly or favorably according to literary convention, political bias, or the dramatic needs of their narratives. For ordinary people across the provinces, the emperor could seem distant and almost abstract, yet his presence was felt through taxation, law, public works, and military security. In towns far from Rome, a coin bearing his face passed from hand to hand in markets and taverns, a small metallic reminder of a political system stretching far beyond what any one person could fully see. The emperor was not only a man. He was a symbol of continuity, anxiety, and ambition, and the Roman world organized itself in part around the hope that such power might remain stable enough to keep bread arriving, roads intact, festivals on time, and the long summer of empire quietly continuing. In the later Roman Empire, the city of Rome itself was no longer the only stage on which Roman power was performed, yet it remained one of the great symbolic hearts of the world. By the time emperors began ruling from other cities more often, the old capital had already accumulated layers of memory so thick that simply walking through it would have felt like moving through time. Temples from the Republic, baths from the Empire, arches raised for victories, and humble neighborhoods pressed together in an urban fabric that was never quite still. Scholars often remind us that Rome was not frozen in one golden age. It changed constantly, with streets widened, shrines repurposed, walls repaired, and buildings slowly aging under soot, weather, and the weight of history. Even decay had a certain grandeur there, because the ruins were not empty. They were inhabited, reused, quarried, and remembered. In that long twilight, Rome remained less a single city than a living archive, where every stone could seem to whisper a different century. One of the quiet marvels of Roman civilization was how efficiently it could move water across great distances. Aqueducts are often imagined as rows of arches soaring across the countryside, and that image is not wrong, but it is only part of the story. Much of an aqueduct ran underground, in covered channels, carefully graded so that water could flow gently by gravity alone. Roman engineers were attentive to slope in a way that feels almost meditative, as if they were listening to the land. They used settling tanks, tunnels, and inspection shafts, and they could adapt routes around hills or valleys with impressive patience. The city of Rome drew on several aqueducts over time, each feeding fountains, baths, gardens, and households of the wealthy. Water was not merely practical in Roman life, it was also a sign of order, abundance, and imperial control. To stand near a public fountain would have been to hear the constant murmur of movement, to see the shimmer of water in the light, and to feel that civilization itself had been made to flow. If water gave the city life, the road system gave the empire its shape. Roman roads are remembered as straight and durable, and again there is truth in that, but their real achievement lay in connection. Roads linked cities to farms, forts to ports, provinces to the capital, and messages to armies. They allowed officials to travel, merchants to trade, and news to move at a pace that would have seemed astonishing in earlier centuries. The famous expression that all roads lead to Rome is not a literal ancient saying in the exact form people often repeat, yet it captures something essential. The city was the center of an immense web. Road builders excavated, layered, drained, and paved with methodical care. Milestones stood along the way like quiet markers of distance and authority. Traveling them would not always have been comfortable. Dust, rain, ruts, and wagon traffic could all make the journey tiring, but the roads made the empire legible, and that legibility helped Rome feel, to those within it, like a world brought into relation. Life in Roman homes varied dramatically according to wealth, but one of the most distinctive domestic spaces was the atrium, a central room in many elite houses where light came through an opening in the roof. Rainwater could fall into a shallow basin below, both practical and elegant, while the room itself acted as a place of reception and display. Guests entering such a house would likely encounter painted walls, polished floors, ancestral images, and the subtle choreography of status. Roman houses could be surprisingly inward-looking. From the street, a house might appear almost severe, yet inside it could open onto courtyards, gardens, dining rooms, and private chambers arranged around layers of controlled access. The design reflected Roman social life, which balanced publicity and privacy in a very particular way. The household was not just a family space, but also a site of politics, patronage, and memory. In the quiet of the morning, clients might arrive to greet their patron, voices echoing softly through the atrium, while the household itself breathed with the rhythms of rank and ritual. Among Rome's most enduring legacies is the idea of law as something systematic, something that could be studied, refined, and applied beyond a single ruler's whim. Roman law did not appear all at once, nor was it perfectly consistent, but over time it developed a remarkable vocabulary for property, contracts, inheritance, injury, citizenship, and obligation. Jurists debated fine distinctions with an almost architectural precision, building a legal tradition that later societies would admire and adapt. Some legal principles were practical, others deeply tied to hierarchy, and many excluded large numbers of people from full participation. Slaves, women, foreigners, and the poor all occupied different positions within that system. Even so, the Roman achievement lay partly in abstraction. A law could be written down, interpreted, cited, and preserved. It could outlast the immediate presence of the magistrate who first pronounced it. That sense of continuity, of order surviving individual lifetimes, gave Roman legal culture a strangely calming gravity, as though society itself had been translated into durable words. Religion in ancient Rome was not confined to a single temple or doctrine. It spread through homes, crossroads, farms, military camps, and the public life of the city. Romans made offerings to household gods, honored protective spirits, and observed rituals intended to maintain the favor of the divine. A great deal of Roman religion was about correct practice rather than personal belief in the modern sense. One did not necessarily need to feel a certain way inwardly, so long as the ritual gestures were performed properly and at the proper time. The result was a world filled with signs, omens, sacrifices, vows, and festivals. Priests and magistrates often worked together, and the boundary between religion and civic duty was thin. Temples stood as architectural affirmations of the relationship between gods and state, their columns bright in the sun, their interiors dim and fragrant with smoke. The ancient Romans understood piety as a kind of maintenance, a careful tending of human and divine relationships, as regular and necessary as mending a roof before the rains. Festivals punctuated the Roman calendar and gave the year a repeated softness, a sense that time could be ceremonially renewed. Some celebrations were solemn, some exuberant, and some full of theatrical reversal. There were days devoted to Jupiter, Ceres, Saturn, and many other deities, as well as moments when the city seemed to suspend ordinary discipline and drift into play. Saturnalia is perhaps the best known of these, remembered for gift-giving, feasting, and the temporary loosening of social rules. The details vary according to our sources, and later traditions sometimes exaggerate the holiday's freedom, but the general atmosphere seems clear enough, a time when even the rigid Roman world could permit laughter and inversion. Elsewhere in the year, processions wound through streets, altars smoked, and families shared ritual meals. These occasions were not merely entertainment. They linked private life to public order, human effort to cosmic timing. A festival in Rome could feel like a pause in the machinery of the year, a gentle breathing space between duties. The Roman army was one of the most formidable institutions in the ancient world, but its strength came from discipline as much as from courage. Soldiers trained with heavy equipment, marched long distances, built camps at the end of the day, and operated within a strict chain of command. The legion became a kind of mobile community, carrying with it tools, standards, engineering skill, and a shared military identity. It was not simply a matter of fighting. Roman troops dug trenches, constructed roads, repaired bridges, and laid out fortifications with routine efficiency. Their camps were often remarkably orderly, almost little cities of their own, with gates, streets, tents, and defenses assembled anew wherever the army stopped. Ancient authors loved to emphasize Roman toughness, and modern scholars still study how military organization supported expansion and control. Yet behind the martial reputation lies a slower picture too. Men far from home, living by routine, sleep, hunger, weather, and the endless repetition of drill. The army's power depended on all those ordinary, exhausting hours. Beyond the centers of power, Roman Britain, Gaul, Hispania, Africa, and the eastern provinces each absorbed Roman influence in different ways, producing an empire that was never culturally uniform. Local languages, foods, customs, and gods continued to matter, even as Roman architecture, administration, and military presence spread. In some places, Romanization was embraced by local elites eager to gain status. In others, it was partial, negotiated, or resisted. A villa in one region might display mosaics and bath complexes in the Roman style, while nearby villages preserved older ways of living. Archaeology often reveals this blending more clearly than literature does. Pottery patterns, burial habits, inscriptions, and house layouts show that empire was not simply imposed from above, it was lived through on the ground, with adaptation at every level. This mixture could be subtle and quiet. A person might pray to a local deity with a Latin inscription. A child might hear several languages in the same market. The empire was immense, but in daily life it was composed of countless small accommodations. Roman entertainment is sometimes remembered for its noise and spectacle, but its forms were more varied than gladiatorial combat alone. Theatres offered comedies, tragedies, mime, music, and dance. Amphitheatres drew crowds to watch hunts and contests. Chariot racing, perhaps the most beloved public pastime in the city of Rome, filled the Circus Maximus with an energy that could feel almost tidal. Factions of supporters, in their colours, cheered with intense loyalty, and the races themselves combined skill, danger, and the thrill of speed. We do not always know exactly what a typical spectator felt, and the surviving sources were often written by elites who alternated between fascination and disdain. Still, it is easy to imagine the atmosphere. Dust in the air, the smell of animals and sweat, the metallic creak of harnesses, the roar rising as the chariots rounded the turning posts. These entertainments were not separate from Roman politics or religion. They were woven into civic life, funded, supervised, and used to express generosity, power, and collective identity. And yet, for all its grandeur, Roman life depended on ordinary labor carried out by countless people whose names never reached the history books. Bakers, masons, scribes, launders, dockworkers, midwives, stable hands, craftsmen, and market sellers all kept the city and empire moving. Slaves formed a huge part of the labor force, though the conditions of slavery varied widely from domestic service to agricultural toil to skilled work in workshops and offices. Freedom, too, was a complicated category in Rome. Freed people could rise in status in some circumstances, while still bearing the marks of former enslavement. The economy of the empire rested on these layered relationships, often hidden behind monumental architecture and imperial rhetoric. To look closely at Roman life is to see not only emperors and senators, but hands carrying bread, repairing nets, polishing bronze, and copying letters by lamplight. In that dense human world, greatness and exhaustion lived side by side, and the long afternoon of Rome was made from both. As the Roman world stretched wider and wider, one of its most practical achievements was the road network that bound the empire together. Roman roads were not simply strips of stone laid across the countryside. They were carefully engineered routes, built in layers with drainage, foundations, and a surface that could withstand the passage of boots, wagons, and marching feet. In many places they ran straight for long distances, cutting over hills rather than gently circling them, because Roman builders valued efficiency and permanence. Milestones stood along the way, marking distances and helping travelers understand how far they had come. For soldiers, merchants, tax collectors, and messengers, these roads meant speed and reliability. For the empire as a whole, they meant control. A governor in a distant province could receive orders more quickly. Reinforcements could be moved with greater confidence. News traveled along the same hard-packed arteries as olive oil, wine, grain, and marble. Even now, some ancient Roman roads still influence modern routes, a quiet reminder that the empire's reach was not only military or political, but also deeply logistical, built into the landscape itself. Travel across those roads depended on a system of rest stops and inns that made long journeys more manageable. Romans called some of these places mansions, official stopping points where travelers could sleep, change animals, or obtain supplies. There were also smaller stations, more modest and less regulated, that catered to ordinary movement along the roads. One can imagine the evening scenes: dust settling outside, harnesses being loosened, lamps lit in simple rooms, and the sound of tired voices in a mix of Latin accents and local dialects. Travel in the Roman world was often slow and uncomfortable, especially for those without wealth or official support. Yet the infrastructure made movement possible on a scale that earlier societies had rarely achieved. Important letters, tax records, and goods could be carried through the empire in a rhythm of stops and starts. Still, road travel was never perfectly safe. Bad weather, rough terrain, banditry, and the fatigue of animals all imposed limits. The very existence of these stations reveals how carefully Rome tried to impose order on distance, creating a connected world out of a vast and sometimes difficult geography. At the center of Roman public life stood the Forum, a space that was at once political, commercial, religious, and social. Every major city of Rome's world tried to build its own forum, though the one in the city of Rome became the most famous and complex of all. There, temples, basilicas, open squares, and commemorative monuments crowded together in a landscape layered with centuries of power. Citizens might gather to hear speeches, watch trials, conduct business, or simply stand in the shade and follow the rumors of the day. The Forum was not quiet in the way a modern museum is quiet. It was full of footsteps, bargaining, legal arguments, and the echoed calls of public life. Even so, there was an order to it, and that order reflected Roman ideals of civic identity. A forum was more than an open plaza. It was a statement that public affairs belonged in a visible, shared space. Standing there, one would have been surrounded by the architecture of authority, where every column and statue seemed to insist that Roman life was organized by law, memory, and hierarchy. This public world extended into the Roman basilica, a building type that later influenced churches across Europe, though in Roman times it had a more civic purpose. A basilica was typically a long, rectangular hall with a central nave and side aisles, often ending in a semicircular apse. Inside, light could enter from above, and the high ceiling helped create a sense of spaciousness and formality. People used basilicas for law courts, business deals, and administrative gatherings. In a bustling city, they offered shelter from the weather and a place where public speech could carry clearly. The architecture itself encouraged attention and movement, guiding visitors toward the areas where magistrates sat or where important discussions took place. Roman architects understood that buildings could shape behavior, and the basilica did so gently but firmly. Its form suggested openness, yet also order. Its size conveyed confidence, while its interior divisions kept the crowd from becoming chaotic. As Rome evolved, this building type remained one of its most enduring contributions, though much of its later fame would belong to a different world, one that adapted Roman space to new religious purposes. In the homes of the wealthy, Roman life could appear far more private, but even there, the social world was carefully staged. Elite houses often centered on the atrium, an open area that received light and rain through a roof opening above, with a shallow basin below to catch water. Around it lay rooms arranged for family use, business meetings, and ceremonial hospitality. The household was not merely a place to live, it was also a place to display status. Visitors entered through decorated doorways, past painted walls or mosaic floors, and encountered the subtle language of patronage and prestige. The house could be used to receive clients, the dependents who arrived each morning to seek favor or support from their patron. In this setting, domestic architecture became political in miniature. Wealth was expressed in marble, bronze, frescoes, and carefully curated objects from across the empire. Even the arrangement of space could suggest who belonged where and who should wait. Yet these grand houses also relied on labor, especially enslaved workers who prepared meals, maintained lamps, managed accounts, and kept the household running. The calm elegance visible in surviving ruins often hides the constant activity that made such homes function. Roman dining also reflected this blend of comfort, display, and hierarchy. The wealthy sometimes ate in the triclinium, a dining room furnished with 3 couches arranged around a low table. Guests reclined while eating, a posture that signaled leisure and status rather than labor. Meals could stretch over several courses, with appetizers, fish, meat, fruit, sweets, and wine diluted with water. The experience was social as much as culinary. Conversation might range from politics to poetry to gossip from the streets. Servants moved quietly between diners, bringing dishes and clearing away platters, while the arrangement of the room reinforced rank. The most honored guest usually occupied the best position on the couch. Yet Roman dining was not always extravagant. Most people ate in humbler settings and with simpler fare, relying on bread, porridge, vegetables, and whatever meat or fish was available. Still, the elite banquet has survived in the imagination because it revealed so much about Roman values. Food was never only nourishment. It was a performance of generosity, cultural refinement, and control over resources. In the lamplight of evening, the triclinium could become a small theatre of empire, where luxury and obligation quietly shared the table. The Romans were also deeply interested in baths, which became some of the most beloved public buildings in their world. Bath complexes were often vast, containing changing rooms, cold pools, warm rooms, hot rooms, exercise spaces, gardens, and sometimes libraries or lecture halls. Their operation depended on clever heating systems, including the hypocaust, which sent hot air beneath floors and through walls. Entering a bathhouse would have meant stepping into a different atmosphere entirely. Warm stone, moist air, the scent of oil, the sound of splashing and conversation, and the hum of many bodies gathered together. Bathing was not only about cleanliness, though that mattered. It was about relaxation, social interaction, and the experience of civic life. People met friends, discussed business, listened to philosophical debate, or simply rested. These spaces were open to a surprisingly broad cross-section of society, though gender, wealth, and local custom affected access. Baths were one of the clearest expressions of Roman engineering serving daily pleasure. They turned infrastructure into comfort, and they made communal routine into something almost ceremonial. In a world without modern plumbing, the baths offered a vision of abundance that felt both practical and luxurious at once. Aqueducts made this entire culture of water possible on a grand scale. These long channels carried fresh water from distant springs and rivers into cities, often across impressive distances and varying terrain. Some ran underground, while others crossed valleys on striking arches that still stand in fragments today. The engineering required was meticulous because the slope had to remain gentle and constant enough for water to flow without stagnating or rushing too quickly. Aqueducts supplied fountains, baths, latrines, workshops, and private households for those rich enough to connect to the system. They transformed urban life by making water more regular and abundant, and they also served as visible symbols of Roman competence. A city with an aqueduct could seem cleaner, healthier, and more civilized, at least from the Roman point of view. The structures themselves could inspire awe, stretching across the landscape with measured confidence. Yet aqueducts were not magic. They required maintenance, legal oversight, and labor. Channels needed repair, sediment had to be cleared, and water rights had to be protected. What appears now as elegant stonework was once part of an active system, a living network that quietly fed the heart of the city. In the countryside, Roman agriculture remained the foundation of wealth, and much of it revolved around the estate or villa, owned by elites who drew income from land. Villas could range from modest working farms to luxurious country homes with gardens, baths, and decorated reception rooms. Some estates were places of retreat, where wealthy Romans escaped the noise of the city for a season. Others were serious centers of production, with granaries, presses, tools, and enslaved laborers managing fields of grain, vines, and olives. The rhythms of rural life were seasonal and demanding. Planting, harvesting, pruning, and pressing all had their place in the agricultural calendar. The countryside around Rome itself became densely developed over time, while farther provinces produced the staples that fed urban populations. Grain from Egypt and North Africa, for example, helped sustain the capital. Olive oil and wine moved in huge quantities through trade networks that linked farms to ports and ports to cities. The villa system reveals how Rome's elegance was underwritten by land, labor, and extraction. Even in peaceful surroundings, the empire's economy was organized by hierarchy, with rural wealth flowing upward into urban power. Roman religion, too, was woven into everyday life rather than confined to grand temples alone. Households maintained shrines to the household gods, often called the Lares and Penates, and small offerings could be made daily with remarkable familiarity. A family might place food, wine, or incense before these images as part of regular routine, asking for protection and prosperity. In the streets and crossroads of cities, local shrines and altars marked sacred spaces that were part of ordinary movement. Public religion, meanwhile, involved processions, sacrifices, festivals, and the formal rituals of the state. Roman religion was less about private belief in the modern sense, and more about correct practice, reciprocity, and maintaining harmony with divine powers. The gods were approached through tradition, gesture, and careful observance. Temples provided a home for divine presence, but worship often took place outside them, in open air or at domestic altars. This blend of public and private devotion gave Roman life a layered sacred quality. A person could pass from marketplace to shrine, from military duty to prayer, with no sharp divide between the practical and the holy. In that sense, the sacred was part of the city's daily breathing, present in gestures so familiar they might almost be missed. And through all of this, Roman time itself was organized with practical attention to the sky, the seasons, and the needs of civic life. The Roman calendar was not always fixed in the form later generations would know. Earlier versions were adjusted over time, and before the Julian reform, the system could become confused by political manipulation and irregular intercalation. Julius Caesar's calendar reform created a more regular solar year, helping bring order to months that had drifted away from the seasons. Yet even after this reform, Roman people experienced time through festivals, market days, work cycles, military campaigns, and religious obligations. Days were often counted backward from important fixed points in the month, a system that seems unusual today but made sense within Roman habits of calculation. Sundials and water clocks helped mark the hours, though daylight remained the most immediate measure. The result was a world where time felt both structured and responsive. It was not the relentless mechanical rhythm of the modern clock, but a slower pattern shaped by sun, ceremony, and necessity. In Rome, as in much of the ancient world, the passing of time was something seen in shadows, felt in the length of the afternoon, and remembered through the repetition of festivals and seasons. By the end of the Roman Republic and into the imperial age, the city of Rome had become a place where water itself was a kind of public performance. The great aqueducts did not simply bring water to the city in a practical sense, though they certainly did that. They shaped the daily rhythm of Roman life, feeding bathhouses, fountains, gardens, workshops, and homes with a steady flow that seemed almost miraculous to people accustomed to more fragile systems. In the bright hours of the day, one could imagine the endless movement of water through stone channels and beneath arches, a quiet engineering achievement stretching over hills and valleys before reaching the crowded city. Some aqueducts carried water for many miles, and ancient writers admired them as signs of Roman discipline and power. Yet even they could not always agree on exact measurements or sources, and modern scholars still examine traces of repairs, changes, and reroutings that reveal how these works lived and adapted over time. Their stone vaults stood in the open air like orderly lines against the sky, while underground sections moved unseen through the earth. To a traveler approaching Rome, such infrastructure would have announced that this was a city where nature had been guided, almost persuaded into service. And at dusk, when the fountains continued to murmur and the public baths still steamed gently in the fading light, the aqueducts remained part of the city's breathing, patient and constant. That same Roman skill for organization could be seen in the empire's roads, which connected not only distant provinces, but also the everyday imagination of Roman power. The famous phrase often associated with these roads suggests straightness, purpose, and command, and indeed many Roman routes were laid out with remarkable efficiency. But the reality was more varied, with roads adapting to hills, river crossings, local terrain, and older pathways that predated Roman control. In the countryside, a road might pass between olive groves, low walls, and scattered farmsteads, carrying merchants, soldiers, messengers, and pilgrims. The surfaces could be stone, gravel, or packed earth depending on location and importance, and the mileage markers along the way helped travelers understand distance in a world without modern speed. For the Romans, roads were not merely practical. They were an expression of order extending outward from the city, a way of binding the empire together with lines of movement and communication. A message could travel faster because of them, an army could arrive more reliably because of them, and a provincial town could feel less isolated because of them. Yet road maintenance was never effortless, and rain, traffic, erosion, and neglect constantly demanded attention. The quiet persistence of these routes, repaired and reused across generations, is part of what made Roman rule feel durable, even when political life in the capital was uneasy or uncertain. In the center of that political life stood the Roman Senate, an institution that survived for centuries by changing its meaning again and again. In the Age of Kings, in the Republic, and then under the emperors, the Senate remained a place where elite men gathered, debated, and displayed their dignity. Its chamber was not always the most powerful room in Rome, but it was often one of the most symbolically important. Marble, wood, and the echoes of oratory gave the setting a solemn atmosphere, while procedures and traditions gave the members a sense of continuity with the city's deep past. Senators wore togas marked by rank, and their speech, at least in theory, reflected restraint and civic responsibility. But the Senate was also a stage for rivalry, ambition, and careful political performance. Under the emperors, its authority narrowed, though it did not disappear, and it continued to matter as a source of legitimacy and as an arena where great families preserved prestige. Ancient authors sometimes wrote about the Senate as though it embodied the virtue of the old republic, while others noted its compromises and anxieties. The truth likely lay somewhere between ideal and reality, because this was a body built from memory as much as from power. It represented the Roman belief that public life should appear ordered, spoken, and formal, even when real influence had already moved elsewhere. Alongside this political theatre, Roman religion filled the city with a sense that unseen forces had to be honored, negotiated with, and carefully watched. Temples stood throughout Rome, some grand and gleaming, others smaller and intimate, housing images of gods whose stories linked myth, tradition, and civic identity. The Romans did not usually separate religion from public life in the way modern societies often do. A military campaign, an election, a harvest, a marriage, or the founding of a building could all require ritual attention. Priests and priestesses, augurs, flamines, and other religious officials performed duties that were as much about social order as spiritual feeling. Sacrifices, prayers, and offerings were deeply formal, yet they also carried personal hopes and anxieties. Even the interpretation of bird flight or lightning could shape important decisions, because the gods were believed to communicate in signs that needed careful reading. Over time, Rome absorbed foreign cults and local divinities from across the Mediterranean, adding layers to its religious landscape rather than replacing one system with another. This flexibility gave Roman religion a remarkably broad and practical character. Still, behind the public ceremony, there may also have been private devotion, fear, gratitude, and quiet longing. In the cool shadow of a temple porch, with incense drifting upward and sandals scraping gently on stone, religion offered the Romans a language for living inside an unpredictable world. The daily life of ordinary Romans, far from the Senate and temple steps, unfolded in apartment blocks, workshop lanes, market spaces, and modest homes whose remains sometimes still speak through floor plans and fragments of painted plaster. In the crowded city, many people lived in insularly multi-story buildings that could be noisy, practical, and at times unstable. These structures created a vertical urban life, with families, labourers, shopkeepers, and tenants sharing walls and staircases. Wealthier households might occupy lower floors or private houses, where atriums, courtyards, and decorative rooms allowed for a more spacious domestic rhythm. Meals, work, conversation, children's games, and domestic chores shaped the day. Cooking smoke, bread ovens, lamp oil, and the smell of stored grain would have mingled in the air. Archaeology gives us only partial glimpses of these lives, since humble possessions often survive unevenly, and written sources usually favor elites. Yet inscriptions, graffiti, household objects, and the remains of food or pottery help restore some of the texture. Children played with small toys and animals, adults bargained over goods or managed clients, neighbors heard one another through thin walls. Rome was not only made of grand monuments, it was also made of many small routines, repeated quietly. Those routines, with their practical concerns and familiar sounds, gave the city its living pulse far more often than triumphal arches or speeches in the forum. Food itself reveals another layer of Roman life, one that moved between abundance and restraint, luxury and necessity. The Roman diet varied widely depending on wealth, region, and season, but grain remained central, often turned into bread, porridge, or flat cakes. Vegetables, legumes, olives, cheese, fish, fruit, and wine appeared in different combinations across the social spectrum. For the elite, banquets could become elaborate displays of status, complete with multiple courses, exotic ingredients, and carefully staged hospitality. Ancient writers sometimes described such dinners with admiration, sometimes with moral concern, as if excess at table reflected excess in character. Yet even the simplest meal had cultural meaning. Eating was not merely consumption, but a social act shaped by household, class, and ritual habit. Markets brought in supplies from across the empire, from North African grain to Spanish oil, from Gallic pottery to Eastern spices. Roman trade networks made the city's tables more diverse than any local countryside alone could have supported. At the same time, the realities of hunger, price fluctuations, and distribution mattered greatly, especially for the urban poor. Public grain doles helped stabilize the capital, though they also reflected political calculation. In a city this large, food was never just private nourishment. It was a matter of order, access, and survival, carried in sacks, baskets, jars, and amphorae through streets that never seemed entirely still. The Roman calendar gives another sense of how thoroughly religion, politics, and time were intertwined. For the Romans, the year was not simply a neutral sequence of months. It was marked by festivals, market days, sacred anniversaries, and moments considered favorable or unfavorable for public business. Some days belonged to Jupiter, others to Mars, others to the memory of ancestors or the honored dead. The rhythm of festivals could bring processions, games, sacrifices, and communal gatherings that broke the ordinary flow of life. Seasonal observances tied the city to agricultural cycles as well, reminding Romans that their urban grandeur still depended on the land beyond the walls. The calendar itself changed over time, especially as Roman timekeeping was reformed and standardized, and scholars continue to study how older religious patterns survived within newer structures. In everyday practice, the calendar was a living tool of memory. It told people when to appear in court, when not to begin certain tasks, when to honor a god, and when to remember a family event. A Roman might wake to the sound of a festival procession in the street below, or know by habit that a particular day was better for rest than for public action. Time, in this sense, was not abstract. It had texture. It moved through incense, sunlight, legal deadlines, and sacred pauses, all woven together into the Roman experience of the year. One of the most distinctive and enduring symbols of Roman society was the Roman army, whose discipline and mobility helped create and maintain the empire. To imagine the army only as a machine of conquest would be too simple, though conquest was certainly part of its history. It was also an institution of training, routine, engineering, and social mobility for some men who entered its ranks. Soldiers marched in formation, built camps, dug ditches, repaired roads, guarded frontiers, and carried the habits of Roman order into places far from Italy. Their equipment evolved over time and differed by period and region, so the image of a single, unchanging legionary is more modern than ancient. Helmets, shields, armor, sandals, weapons, and pack loads all reflected adaptation as much as tradition. The army's presence could be both reassuring and threatening, depending on perspective. For some provincials, soldiers brought wages, trade, and infrastructure. For others, they represented taxation, coercion, and the reach of imperial authority. In the camps, daily life included drills, maintenance, meals, and the weary repetition of command. Yet letters and inscriptions also hint at friendships, family concerns, religion, and longing. The army was not only a source of power. It was a world of human endurance, where the sounds of metal, the smell of leather, and the weight of distance became part of the soldier's ordinary day. Roman law, meanwhile, gave the empire a language of boundaries and obligations that proved astonishingly influential long after the empire itself had faded. The legal tradition was not created all at once. It developed through custom, public statutes, juristic interpretation, and the decisions of magistrates and emperors. Roman law touched property, inheritance, contracts, family relationships, crime, status, and the rights and duties of citizens and non-citizens. To modern readers it can seem technical, but to Romans it was part of the structure that made social life predictable. A dispute over land, a question of marriage, a debt, or a testament might all pass through legal forms that gave shape to ordinary concerns. Law also reflected hierarchy, because not everyone stood equally before it, and the distinctions between free and enslaved, citizen and outsider, male authority and domestic dependence remained deeply embedded. Still, Roman legal thought prized definition and precedent in ways that left a long legacy in later Europe and beyond. Some legal texts survive as elegant abstractions, while others reveal the practical messiness of real disputes, where documents, witnesses, and interpretation mattered. There is something quietly human in this. The law tried to make life legible, even though life itself was often tangled, emotional, and incomplete. In the background of Roman civilization, law functioned like a grammar of social order, usually invisible until it was needed. As the empire expanded, it became increasingly multilingual and multicultural, though Latin remained the language most associated with authority in the West. Greek continued to dominate much of the Eastern Mediterranean and remained a language of education, philosophy, and elite culture throughout Roman history. In Rome itself, people might hear Latin in official contexts, Greek among scholars, merchants, or household slaves, and many other languages brought by migrants, soldiers, and traders from across the empire. This linguistic variety reminds us that Roman identity was never entirely fixed. It was negotiated through citizenship, dress, law, speech, ancestry, and allegiance. Some provincials adopted Roman customs enthusiastically, while others retained local traditions and combined them with new ones. Inscriptions show names shifting, identities blending, and public honors adapting to local circumstances. The result was not a single uniform civilization, but a layered world in which Roman power sat alongside regional memory. In a port city, one might hear the calls of dockworkers, the chatter of travelers, and the formal language of contracts all in the same day. In a household, a child could grow up between languages, learning one for family intimacy and another for public advancement. The empire was held together not by sameness, but by flexible forms of belonging. That flexibility helped Rome endure, even as it also made the empire seem always in motion, always absorbing, translating, and changing. And finally, there is the long afterlife of Rome itself, which may be one of the most remarkable facts of all. Ancient Rome did not simply vanish when political power shifted away from the city. Its buildings fell into ruin, its institutions transformed, its gods were replaced or reinterpreted, and yet Rome remained present in law, architecture, language, art, religion, and political imagination. Medieval rulers, Renaissance scholars, modern statesmen, and archaeologists all looked back to Rome for models, warnings, and prestige. Sometimes they admired its order, sometimes its grandeur, sometimes its fall. The city became both a historical place and a symbol, carrying meanings far beyond its original streets. Even the ruins themselves have spoken differently in different centuries. A broken column could suggest the glory of antiquity, the fragility of power, or the patience of time. The Colosseum, Forum, baths, temples, and roads all passed into later memory, where they were studied, painted, quarried, preserved, or romanticized. Scholars still debate many aspects of Roman life because the evidence is uneven, partial, and often filtered through elite voices. Yet perhaps that uncertainty is fitting. Rome was never a fixed object, but a continuing process of building, ruling, remembering, forgetting, and rebuilding. Its history lingers not as a single story, but as a deep echo, settling softly across the centuries like dust on stone.